For 30 years, I bled grease and sweat over heavy diesel engines, draining every cent of my early retirement to build my son a life of luxury. But my ultimate reward came today, standing over my wife's casket in a suffocating church. That is when my son pressed a forged will against my chest and aggressively whispered for me to sign away everything we owned. He thought he had outsmarted a tired old mechanic. He did not know that in exactly 5 minutes my wife's attorney was going to lock me in the church vestry and play a hidden voicemail from the grave, a voicemail that named her own son as her killer. The air inside the First Methodist Church was thick and unyielding, smelling of old polished wood, damp wool, and an overwhelming volume of white lilies. Those lilies were Catherine's favorite. She used to grow them in the small garden behind our house in suburban Pennsylvania, tending to them with the same gentle patience she applied to every aspect of our 40 years of marriage. Now, dozens of those beautiful flowers were arranged in massive, suffocating wreaths surrounding her closed oak casket. I stood there staring at the polished wood, listening to the low, droning hum of the organ playing a mournful hymn. The sound seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards and up into my aching knees. My name is Silas Croft. I am 68 years old, and my body feels every single day of those years. I looked down at my hands resting on the edge of the pew. They are the hands of a union diesel mechanic. The knuckles are swollen and permanently scarred. The skin is thick, calloused, and lined with engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever completely wash away. For 3 decades, I spent my life on cold concrete floors, wrestling with 1,000-pound engine blocks, pulling heavy transmissions out of commercial trucks, and breathing in diesel exhaust. I worked double shifts. I worked weekends. I worked through freezing winters with aching joints and a back that screamed in protest every time I stood up. I did it all for one reason. I did it so my son Bradley would never have to work with his hands. I wanted him to have the life I never had. Catherine and I poured every ounce of our energy into that boy. We paid for his expensive private schools, his college tuition, and eventually the massive capital required to start his own high-end investment brokerage firm. I liquidated my early retirement, cashing out my union pension and draining the savings accounts I had built through blood and sweat just to fund his Wall Street dreams. I gave him my future so he could have his own. And this is where it led me. Standing alone by a casket, a broken widower, wondering how the woman who was my entire world could be taken away so abruptly. The medical examiner called it sudden heart failure. She had been perfectly fine, and then she was gone, leaving a void in my chest so vast I felt like I was falling into it. The murmurs of the congregation behind me faded into a dull, meaningless buzz. I was completely consumed by the heavy silence radiating from the oak box in front of me. I was waiting for the funeral director to signal that it was time to take our seats. I was waiting for the agonizing process of saying a final goodbye. Then I heard it. The sharp, confident, aggressive click of leather dress shoes striding down the main aisle. The sound was entirely out of place in a house of mourning. It was not the slow, hesitant shuffle of someone coming to offer condolences. It was the rapid, purposeful march of a man walking into a boardroom. I did not have to turn my head to know who it was. Bradley stopped right beside me. He did not look at the casket. He did not place a comforting hand on my shoulder. He did not embrace me or share in the profound devastation of losing the woman who gave him life. He just stood there, exuding a cold, calculated impatience. I turned my head slowly to look at my son. He was 35 years old, but in that moment he felt like an absolute stranger. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that easily cost more than I made in 2 months at the garage. His hair was meticulously styled, not a single strand out of place despite the strong autumn wind outside. His gold watch gleamed under the church lights. But it was his face that truly terrified me. There was not a single tear. There was no redness around his eyes, no tremble in his jaw, no sorrow whatsoever. His expression was flat, clinical, and predatory. He looked at me with the cold annoyance of a man dealing with an incompetent employee. "Bradley," I whispered, my voice hoarse and raw from days of weeping. "Your mother." He did not let me finish. Without a shred of grief or hesitation, Bradley reached inside the breast pocket of his expensive Italian jacket. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder and a premium, heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. Before I could register what he was doing, he stepped into my personal space. He moved with a sudden, jarring aggression, pressing the heavy folder flat against my chest right over my heart. He pushed the gold pen into my scarred hand, forcing my fingers to close around it. "Sign it, Dad," he whispered. His voice was not a comfort. It was a command, a razor blade slicing through the somber, heavy atmosphere of the church. I looked down at the folder pressed against my chest. The bold black letters printed on the top page glared up at me, burning themselves into my retinas. Last will and testament of Silas and Catherine Croft, revised and amended. My brain struggled to process the sheer depravity of what was happening. This was a newly drafted document, one I had never seen before. I glanced at the visible clauses on the front page. It was an immediate, unconditional transfer of executor rights. It was designed to grant Bradley total and instantaneous control over the entire estate, the house, the remaining bank accounts, and most glaringly, Catherine's massive life insurance policy. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling not from sadness but from the sudden freezing shock of his audacity. My wife, his mother, was lying dead in a box inches away from us, and he was using her funeral as a venue for a hostile takeover of our family assets. Bradley leaned in closer. His expensive cologne washed over me completely, suffocating the smell of the funeral lilies. "It is what Mom wanted," he hissed, his eyes darting around the room to ensure none of the arriving guests were close enough to hear him. "She wanted me to handle the finances so you would not have to stress yourself out in your old age. The bank needs these documents signed and filed by 5 o'clock this afternoon. They will not process the estate transfer without your signature on the revisions. By 5 o'clock today." I repeated the words, feeling like ash in my mouth. "We are burying her today, Bradley. We are burying your mother. Put this away." I tried to push the folder back into his chest, but he stepped forward, using his weight to pin the documents against me. The polished, successful Wall Street facade he wore so proudly began to crack, revealing the spoiled, ruthless, and greedy boy hiding underneath the expensive suit. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," Bradley whispered, his tone dropping into something dark and vicious. "I do not have time for your emotional delays. My firm is expanding. I have partners flying in tomorrow. I need this capital unlocked immediately to secure a margin call on a new development project. Mom knew about it. She agreed to it. Now do not make a scene and just sign the damn papers." A hot, righteous anger sparked deep in my chest. It was a slow burning fire, igniting the exhaustion and the grief, transforming them into a cold, hard clarity. I spent 30 years sacrificing my bones, my joints, and my future for this boy. I gave up every comfort so he could sit in a glass tower and trade imaginary money. And this is how he repays that unconditional love. He preys on my grief. He tries to extort his grieving father over his mother's unburied corpse. I looked my son dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice, but the tone I used was the same one I used when a 1,000-pound engine block was swinging dangerously on a broken chain hoist. Hard, immovable, and absolute. "I am not signing anything today, Bradley. I am not signing anything tomorrow. Step back from me, put those papers away, and show some respect for the woman who gave you life." Bradley's face flushed red with sudden fury. The muscles in his jaw locked. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his breath against my ear. "If you do not sign this right now, Dad, I will make a single phone call and freeze every joint account associated with this family. I will freeze the payments to the funeral home. They will stop this service right now. Do you hear me? The director will walk out here and halt the ceremony because the check will bounce. Do you want to embarrass Mom in front of half the town? Do you want them rolling her casket back into the hearse and locking the church doors because her stubborn, ignorant old man would not sign a piece of paper?" The threat hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The absolute cruelty of his psychological blackmail paralyzed me for a fleeting second. He was holding his own mother's funeral hostage. He was willing to publicly desecrate Catherine's final farewell just to get his hands on the insurance money a few days early. He was weaponizing my love, my grief, and my pride against me. I looked down at the heavy gold pen gripped in my scarred, calloused hand. I felt the overwhelming weight of the day pressing down on me. A part of me, the tired, broken, devastated widower, just wanted the pain to stop. A part of me wanted to scrawl my name on the line just so I could bury my wife in peace. But the man who had spent a lifetime weathering the brutal storms of blue-collar labor, the man who relied on integrity and grit to survive, refused to crumble. I tightened my grip on the pen, preparing to throw it onto the floor of the sanctuary. The standoff was razor-sharp. The tension between us was a physical force tightening like a coiled spring ready to snap. Bradley was glaring at me, his eyes wide with aggressive entitlement, waiting for the frail old mechanic to break under the pressure. But before I could react, the heavy, solid oak doors at the side of the sanctuary swung open with a loud, jarring thud. Rapid, heavy footsteps hurried down the side aisle, echoing loudly over the soft organ music. I turned my head and saw Thomas Wright practically jogging toward us. Thomas was Catherine's longtime private family trust attorney. He was 60 years old, a man known for his immaculate composure, his slow, deliberate way of speaking, and his perfectly tailored tweed suits. But today, Thomas was a picture of sheer panic. His face was pale, devoid of all color, and covered in a thick sheen of nervous sweat. His tie was slightly crooked, and he was clutching a battered leather briefcase tightly to his chest as if his life depended on it. He marched directly up to the casket, completely ignoring Bradley's imposing presence. Thomas reached out and grabbed my forearm. His grip was frantic, his fingers digging into my jacket with surprising strength. "Silas," Thomas gasped, his voice urgent, breathless, and shaking with a terror I had never heard from him before. "I am so sorry to interrupt. You need to come with me to the vestry right now, immediately. It cannot wait another second." Bradley stepped in smoothly, shifting his body to block our path. He plastered his artificial, condescending corporate smile back onto his face. "Thomas," Bradley said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "My father is deeply grieving right now. We are in the middle of handling some urgent private family estate matters. Whatever legal triviality you have can wait until tomorrow. Let the man mourn." Thomas stopped. He turned slowly and looked Bradley dead in the eye. The seasoned attorney's gaze was filled with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound horror. He looked at my son as if he were staring at a venomous snake preparing to strike. "It cannot wait, Bradley," Thomas snapped, his voice cracking like a whip through the quiet church. "And it has absolutely nothing to do with the estate." Without waiting for a response, Thomas yanked my arm, pulling me away from the casket with a desperate force. He dragged me down the side aisle, moving with a speed that left me stumbling to keep up. He guided me directly toward the small, empty vestry room located just behind the choir loft. I glanced back over my shoulder as I was pulled away. Bradley was standing alone by his mother's casket. The arrogant smirk had vanished from his face. His jaw was clenched tight, and he was staring after us with dark, narrowed eyes. The forged will was still gripped tightly in his fist, slightly crumpled from the tension. He looked nervous. He looked like a man who suddenly realized he had lost control of the narrative. Thomas shoved me through the narrow doorway of the vestry and followed right behind me. Before I could even ask a question, he slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the deadbolt with a loud, echoing click. The thick wood instantly muted the organ music and the murmurs of the congregation, sealing us in a heavy, suffocating silence. The heavy oak door of the vestry slammed shut behind us, and the echoing click of the deadbolt felt like a gunshot in the confined space. Instantly, the muted hum of the organ and the suffocating scent of the funeral lilies vanished, replaced by the smell of old paper floor wax and the sharp metallic tang of pure fear radiating from Thomas Wright. I stood in the center of the small room, my hands still clenched into fists from the confrontation with my son, my chest heaving as I tried to process the abrupt transition. Thomas did not look at me. The impeccably dressed, unflappable family attorney who had guided Catherine and me through 3 decades of legal matters was completely unraveling right before my eyes. He was pacing the narrow stretch of floor between the choir robes and the small wooden table. his breathing ragged, his normally pale face flushed and dripping with a cold sweat. He clutched his battered leather briefcase to his chest like a shield, his knuckles white with strain. I demanded to know what was going on. My voice was low, still rough with the gravel of unshed tears and the boiling anger Bradley had just ignited. I reminded Thomas that my wife was lying in a wooden box just 50 feet away, that we were in the middle of burying her, and that my son had just tried to extort me over her unburied body. I told him this had better be a matter of absolute life and death. Thomas stopped pacing. He turned slowly, and the look in his eyes stripped the breath right out of my lungs. It was a look of profound, unadulterated sorrow, mixed with a terror so deep it seemed to age him 10 years in a matter of seconds. He placed his briefcase on the small wooden table, his hands shaking so violently the metal latches rattled against the quiet of the room. He did not open the briefcase. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He looked at me, his voice trembling as he spoke. He said that Catherine had come to his office exactly 1 week before she died. She did not have an appointment. She had walked in through the pouring rain, refusing to sit in the waiting area, demanding to see him immediately. Thomas described my wife, a woman known for her boundless grace and gentle patience, as frantic, paranoid, and utterly terrified. She had made him swear on his life that he would not contact me. She told him I was working a double shift at the garage, that my heart was already under too much strain, and that she needed absolute proof before she destroyed my world. Thomas said he tried to calm her down, tried to understand what had frightened her so completely, but she refused to give him the full details. She only told him that she was investigating something deeply wrong with Bradley's finances, and that she feared our son was no longer the boy we had raised. I felt a cold dread begin to pool in the pit of my stomach. Catherine had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over the rough edges between Bradley and me. For her to bypass me entirely and go straight to our attorney in a state of terror meant she had uncovered something monstrous. Thomas took a ragged breath and looked down at his phone. He explained that when the medical examiner declared her death as sudden heart failure, he knew instantly and completely that it was a lie. Catherine had a heart as strong as an ox. She walked 3 miles every morning and tended a garden that required the stamina of a woman half her age. But Thomas had no proof of foul play, no evidence to bring to the authorities until last night. He told me that Catherine had set up a delayed digital dead man switch, a secured audio file programmed to send to his encrypted legal server if she did not log in to cancel it every 48 hours. Last night, the timer expired, and the file arrived in his inbox. Thomas placed the phone gently on the center of the wooden table. He looked me dead in the eye and warned me that what I was about to hear would change everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the blood running through my own son's veins. He urged me to brace myself. Then, with a trembling finger, he pressed play. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only the sound of static, a low hissing crackle that filled the small vestry. Then came the sound of ragged, labored breathing. I recognized that breath instantly. It was the sound of my Catherine, but it was wrong. It was weak, shallow, and filled with a wet, struggling rattle that made my own chest ache in sympathy. I closed my eyes, picturing her face, feeling a fresh wave of paralyzing grief wash over me. Then her voice broke through the static. "Silas, if you are hearing this, I am gone." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I stumbled back a half step, my shoulders hitting the heavy wooden door behind me. The voice emanating from that small speaker was saturated with pain, but beneath the physical agony, there was a resolute crystalline clarity. It was the voice of a mother who had realized her ultimate failure and a wife trying to protect her husband from beyond the veil. "Do not let Bradley near the house." Her recorded voice commanded the audio, distorting slightly as she coughed a wet, agonizing sound that tore at my sanity. "He has been putting something in my evening tea. I found the red vials in his briefcase. The room started to spin. The walls of the vestry seemed to close in on me, compressing the air until I could barely draw a breath. My mind flashed back to the last few weeks of her life. The evening routine we had shared for decades. Catherine sitting in her favorite floral armchair by the window, a steaming cup of chamomile tea resting on the side table. Bradley had been visiting more often lately. I had been so foolishly happy, thinking my son was finally making an effort to spend time with his aging mother. I remembered him insisting on making the tea, playing the part of the devoted, caring son, walking out of the kitchen with that ceramic mug. I had watched him hand it to her with a smile. I had watched my beautiful, trusting wife raise that cup to her lips, thanking him for his kindness while I sat across the room completely blind to the execution taking place right in front of my eyes. "He needs the estate money to cover a margin call, Silas." Catherine's voice continued growing weaker, fading as if she were sinking into deep water. "He is killing me. Forgive me for not telling you sooner." The recording clicked off, plunging the vestry back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The absence of her voice was a physical void in the room. I stood frozen against the door, my scarred, grease-stained hands trembling uncontrollably at my sides. The reality of her words began to penetrate the thick fog of my grief, sinking into the marrow of my bones. My wife did not die of heart failure. She was murdered. She was systematically, deliberately poisoned in her own living room in her own favorite chair by the boy I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. I thought about the 30 years I had spent working on cold concrete floors. I thought about the double shifts, the missed holidays, the crushing fatigue that I welcomed because it meant I was providing for my family. I had liquidated my early retirement, drained the union pension I had earned with my blood and sweat, and handed it all to Bradley so he could sit in a glass tower and wear custom suits. I had given him the world, and in return he had slipped a deadly toxin into his mother's tea to steal the remaining scraps of our lives. For one long agonizing moment, the profound devastation threatened to break me completely. I felt a scream building in the back of my throat, a primal, animalistic howl of pure agony that wanted to tear its way out and shatter the stained glass windows of the sanctuary. I wanted to collapse onto the floor, to curl into a ball and let the grief consume me until there was nothing left but dust. But the man who had spent 3 decades wrestling 1,000-pound diesel engine blocks back into alignment did not know how to crumble. The fiery, agonizing heat of my tears suddenly stopped. The overwhelming sorrow crystallized in a fraction of a second, hardening into a freezing, calculated rage. The temperature in my blood dropped to absolute zero. The confusion vanished. The blind grief evaporated. What remained was a dark, unyielding clarity, sharp and dangerous as a freshly honed razor. I opened my eyes and looked at Thomas. The terrified attorney was watching me carefully, perhaps expecting me to have a heart attack of my own, perhaps expecting me to break down and weep. But there were no more tears left in me. There was only the cold, hard logic of a mechanic who had just diagnosed a catastrophic failure in the system. I realized exactly what was happening. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying precision. Bradley's aggressive behavior by the casket was not just the arrogance of a greedy son impatient for his inheritance. It was a calculated, desperate distraction. He had cornered me in front of a crowd, pressing those forged documents into my chest, demanding I sign them by a fictitious bank deadline, knowing it would confuse and overwhelm me. He knew I would be paralyzed by the emotional weight of the funeral. He was keeping me pinned down at the church, ensuring I was miles away from our home. "He is not at the reception," I said, my voice eerily calm, lacking any inflection or tremor. Thomas blinked, startled by the sudden shift in my demeanor. He stammered, asking what I meant. I stepped away from the door, my mind working with mechanical efficiency. Bradley had forced the confrontation to keep me occupied. He knew that as long as I was standing over his mother's casket, debating signatures and bank deadlines, the house would be completely empty. He knew that if Catherine had discovered the red vials in his briefcase, she might have hidden them. She might have kept the tea tin. She might have left a journal, a note, or some tangible piece of evidence hidden among her belongings. Bradley was not a fool. He was a ruthless, calculating predator, and a predator always covers their tracks. The signature was a decoy, I stated, moving toward the table. He does not need the signature today. He just needed me to stay here. He needed me distracted while he cleans up his mess. I looked down at Thomas's phone still resting on the table, holding the last words my wife would ever speak. She had used her final breaths to warn me to protect me and to point a shaking finger directly at her killer. I would not let that sacrifice be in vain. I would not let her murderer wipe away the evidence of his crime while I stood around weeping in a church. I reached out and firmly grasped Thomas by the shoulder. I told him to guard that audio file with his life. I instructed him to back it up, to send it to his secure servers, and to make sure it could never be deleted or corrupted by anyone, especially my son's high-priced corporate lawyers. Thomas nodded frantically, clutching his phone to his chest, assuring me that the file was already locked behind layers of legal encryption. I turned toward the heavy oak door. There was no time to explain further. There was no time to gather the mourners or halt the funeral service. Every second I wasted in this vestry was another second Bradley had to scour my home, to tear apart Catherine's study, and to flush the red vials down the drain. If he destroyed the physical evidence, the audio recording alone might not be enough to secure a murder conviction against a wealthy investment broker with a team of ruthless defense attorneys. I needed the poison. I needed the undeniable, tangible proof that tied his hands to the murder weapon. I threw the deadbolt and yanked the heavy door open. The somber organ music drifted back into the room, a stark contrast to the violent storm raging inside my chest. I did not look back at Thomas. I did not look toward the sanctuary where my wife lay resting. I marched straight down the side corridor of the church, my heavy work boots thudding against the polished floorboards with singular purpose. I bypassed the main entrance, slipping out through the side exit into the cold, biting autumn wind. I climbed into the cab of my old, battered pickup truck, the engine roaring to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the familiar calluses on my hands, the hands that had built my son's future, the hands that would now systematically dismantle his entire life. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of the church parking lot. The agonizing grief was gone, locked away in a dark corner of my mind to be felt later. Right now, I was a man on a mission of absolute justice. I had to beat my son home. I had to secure the evidence. And then I was going to set a trap so ironclad, so devastating that Bradley Croft would never see the light of freedom again. I pressed the accelerator toward the floorboard, the old diesel engine straining as I merged onto the highway leading back to the suburbs. The landscape blurred past my windows, a streak of gray autumn skies and dying foliage perfectly matching the desolate wasteland my life had just become. My mind kept looping back to the audio recording. I could hear the wet rattle in Catherine's chest over the roar of the highway. I could hear the terror in her voice. She had died alone in our bedroom, her heart struggling against a chemical invader while I was under a truck chassis 50 miles away, believing she was safe, believing we had years left to enjoy the retirement we had fought so hard to build. The betrayal was a living, breathing entity inside the cab of the truck with me. It gnawed at my insides, demanding to be acknowledged. How many times had Bradley sat at our dinner table over the last few months? How many times had he smiled at his mother, complimented her cooking, and kissed her cheek before leaving? He had weaponized our love. He had used the unconditional trust of a mother to gain access to her evening routine. He knew Catherine drank herbal tea every night at 8 o'clock to help her sleep. He knew I was often working late. He had observed our lives not as a son, but as a tactician looking for the point of maximum vulnerability. The sheer scale of his greed was unfathomable. A margin call. That was what she had said. He was killing her over a margin call. He had overleveraged his high-end real estate developments, played fast and loose with his investors' capital, and when the market turned, he found himself drowning in debt. Instead of facing the consequences of his arrogance, instead of coming to me for help, he had looked at the balance of Catherine's life insurance policy and the equity in our home, and he had made a calculation. He weighed the value of his mother's life against his corporate reputation, and he chose the money. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles ached. I had spent my life fixing broken things. When an engine block cracked, you welded it. When a transmission failed, you rebuilt it gear by gear. But there was no fixing this. Bradley was not a broken machine. He was a corrupted soul. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, stepping out of the realm of a greedy child and into the territory of a cold-blooded monster. I watched the speedometer climb the needle, trembling as I pushed the truck past its limits. I had to beat him there. If Bradley realized Catherine had left a digital trail, he would panic. He would tear the house down to the studs to find the physical proof, the red vials. Catherine had mentioned red vials hidden in his briefcase. If she had found them, she might have confronted him, or worse, she might have stolen one to have it tested. If that vial was still in the house, it was the key to everything. It was the murder weapon, the physical link that would drag Bradley from his glass penthouse down into a concrete cell. The suburban streets of my neighborhood appeared in the distance. The neat rows of houses, the manicured lawns, the quiet, peaceful facade that hid the rot festering inside my own family. I did not slow down as I turned onto our street. I needed to move with absolute silence and predatory precision. The time for weeping was over. Karma was demanding a debt to be paid, and I was going to be the one to collect it. I would gather the proof. I would build the case. And when the hammer finally dropped on Bradley Croft, it would strike with the unstoppable force of a lifetime of blue-collar grit. I slammed the truck into park down the street from my house, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cold air, ready to go to war. The tires of my old Ford truck chewed up the wet asphalt as I tore away from the First Methodist Church. The rusted floorboards vibrated beneath my heavy work boots, humming with the strain of an engine I had rebuilt with my own 2 hands a decade ago. I was pushing the truck past its physical limits, the speedometer needle shaking as I navigated the winding suburban roads of Pennsylvania. Outside, the gray autumn afternoon was giving way to a bitter, biting cold, but inside the cab, my blood was boiling with an intense, fiery heat. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white, the thick calluses on my palms scraping against the cracked leather. For 30 years, I had dragged my exhausted body out of bed before dawn, breathing in toxic exhaust fumes and wrestling with massive steel gears, all to secure a golden future for my only son. I had sacrificed my youth, my aching joints, and my entire early retirement to pay for Bradley's elite education and his high-rise investment firm. And my ultimate reward was the agonizing revelation that the boy I raised had systematically poisoned the only woman I ever truly loved. The highway blurred past my windows a streak of dull colors that matched the bleak wasteland my life had become in the last hour. Catherine's trembling, terrified voice from the hidden audio file echoed in my skull on an endless, torturous loop. She had died in our bedroom, her strong heart struggling against a chemical invader completely alone while I was under a commercial rig 50 miles away, believing she was safe. A margin call. That was the exact phrase she used. Bradley had murdered his own mother to cover a margin call to save his bloated corporate reputation and maintain a lavish lifestyle built entirely on my liquidated pension. He had traded her beautiful life for money, and now he was back at our house, using the emotional weight of the funeral as a decoy to destroy the evidence. I pressed the accelerator harder toward the floorboard. The diesel engine roared in violent protest, but I did not care about ruining the truck. I had to beat him there. If he found those red vials before I did, he would flush them down the drain, and my wife's murder would remain buried forever under a forged death certificate. I turned onto our quiet, manicured street and immediately killed the headlights. The neighborhood was dead silent, the houses sitting far back from the road, behind perfectly trimmed lawns and tall oak trees. I did not pull into my own driveway. Instead, I parked the truck 2 blocks down, wedging it carefully behind a large row of overgrown hedges where it could not be easily seen from the main street. I stepped out into the freezing wind, leaving the heavy doors slightly ajar so they would not make a sound when I closed them. I pulled the collar of my flannel jacket up against the chill and began to walk rapidly toward my home, sticking strictly to the dark shadows cast by the setting sun. As I approached my property, my heart slammed against my ribs with heavy, agonizing thuds. Bradley's glossy black luxury SUV was parked diagonally across the driveway, the engine block still clicking loudly as it cooled in the cold air. He had driven like a complete maniac to get here, completely abandoning his mother's unburied casket just to cover his tracks. He thought I was still at the church, paralyzed by my own grief, surrounded by mourning relatives and empty condolences. He completely underestimated the man who built his entire life from absolutely nothing. I bypassed the front door entirely. I knew this house intimately because I had framed the wooden walls, laid the floors, and installed every single window myself. I moved quietly around to the back patio, stepping carefully on the edge of the grass to avoid crunching the dry, fallen autumn leaves. I reached the side entrance leading directly into the mudroom. I knew the deadbolt on this specific door had a slight mechanical flaw, a loose metal cylinder that required a specific upward push to click open without making a sound. I slid my old key into the lock, applied the exact amount of upward pressure needed, and turned it with agonizing slowness. The heavy door swung open without a single creak. I stepped inside, closing the door silently behind me. The house was suffocatingly warm, the central heating running on high, but the atmosphere was thick with a frantic, destructive energy. From the second floor, I heard the violent sound of heavy wood scraping against the floorboards, followed immediately by the sharp shattering of glass. It was coming directly from Catherine's study. Bradley was up there tearing her personal sanctuary apart with reckless abandon. I could hear him opening wooden drawers with aggressive force and throwing heavy books across the room. He was panicking. He knew Catherine was a meticulous woman, and he was terrified she had left a physical trail of his horrific crimes. I did not rush upstairs to confront him. Confrontation without undeniable evidence was exactly what his expensive corporate lawyers would want. I needed the physical weapon. I crept through the darkened hallway, my heavy work boots completely silent on the thick living room carpet, and moved directly into the kitchen. The space was pristine, smelling faintly of the lemon cleaner Catherine always used on Sunday mornings. My eyes immediately locked onto the tea station arranged neatly on the polished marble counter next to the stove. Catherine had a very specific evening routine that she never skipped. Every night at exactly 8 o'clock, she drank a steaming cup of organic chamomile tea to help her sleep. Bradley knew this intimate routine perfectly. He had weaponized our unconditional trust, offering to make her tea during his recent visits, using the guise of a devoted, caring son to administer the deadly poison. I approached the counter, my chest tightening with a grief so profound it threatened to suffocate me right there in the kitchen. I reached out and gently picked up the vintage tin box where she kept her loose-leaf chamomile. The metal box felt unnaturally heavy in my calloused hands. I opened the lid and stared down at the dried yellow flowers. I carefully poured the contents out onto the counter, sifting through the fragile tea leaves with my scarred, grease-stained fingers. There was nothing inside but tea. For an agonizing second, a massive wave of panic washed over my entire body. What if Bradley had already found the vials? What if Catherine had hidden them somewhere else entirely, and I was wasting precious time? Then my lifelong mechanical instincts kicked in. I weighed the empty tin box in my hands again, analyzing the structure. The physical dimensions were wrong. The interior depth did not match the exterior height of the tin. There was a hidden gap of at least an inch at the base. I turned the tin upside down and pressed my thumbs firmly against the bottom metal panel. I applied steady, even pressure along the edges, feeling carefully for a hidden latch or a pressure-fit seal. With a soft metallic click, the false bottom popped loose from the main frame. I carefully removed the thin metal plate. Tucked inside the hidden compartment, wrapped securely in a small piece of white tissue paper, was a tiny, unmarked red glass vial. It was no larger than my thumb, sealed tightly with a black rubber stopper. Inside the smooth glass, a small amount of clear liquid sloshed gently back and forth. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I was holding the exact instrument of my wife's destruction. This tiny, insignificant piece of glass had stopped the strongest, kindest heart I had ever known. A freezing, calculated rage flooded my veins completely, pushing away the paralyzing grief, replacing it with an ironclad resolve. This was the undeniable proof. This was the key that would lock my son in a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. I quickly wrapped the vial back in the tissue paper and slipped it deep into the front pocket of my heavy flannel jacket, securing it safely against my chest. Just as I snapped the false bottom back into the tin and swept the loose tea leaves quickly into the sink, the frantic noises from the second floor abruptly stopped. Heavy, rapid footsteps pounded against the hardwood of the upstairs hallway, heading directly toward the main staircase. Bradley was coming down. There was absolutely no time to escape through the mudroom. If he caught me standing in the kitchen with a calm, calculated expression, he would know instantly that I had found something important. He would realize the fragile, broken old man act was a complete lie. I needed to play the exact part he expected. I needed to feed his massive ego and his absolute contempt for my perceived weakness. In a fraction of a second, I let the agonizing reality of Catherine's death crash back over me. I allowed my tired knees to buckle, dropping heavily onto the cold kitchen tiles with a loud, jarring thud. I slumped forward, clutching my stomach tightly, and let out a raw, guttural sob that tore painfully at the back of my throat. I did not have to fake the hot tears that flooded my eyes. The devastation of losing my beautiful wife was a bottomless ocean, and I simply opened the floodgates to let the sorrow pour out. Bradley rounded the corner into the kitchen, his breathing heavy, his face flushed red with panic and physical exertion. He froze instantly when he saw me kneeling on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. He was holding a stack of Catherine's personal leather journals in his left hand, his expensive suit jacket discarded somewhere upstairs, his premium silk tie loosened carelessly around his neck. "Dad!" He snapped, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of any human compassion. "What in the world are you doing here? You are supposed to be at the church with the guests." I could not stay there. I choked out my voice, trembling violently as I looked up at him through a thick blur of tears. I let my broad shoulders shake perfectly, portraying a man entirely broken by sorrow. I could not watch them close the cold earth over her Bradley. I just could not do it today. I had to come home. I just wanted to sit in her kitchen and be near her things. I just miss her so much. Bradley stared down at me from his elevated position. For a fleeting, desperate moment, I looked for a shred of genuine guilt in his eyes, a single trace of humanity or remorse for the loving mother he had slaughtered and the devoted father he was currently destroying. But there was absolutely nothing there. His handsome features twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at me the way a wealthy man looks at a diseased stray animal blocking his path on the sidewalk. "Get up off the floor!" he hissed angrily, stepping widely around me to place the heavy journals on the kitchen counter. "You are embarrassing yourself. This is exactly why I need to take full control of the estate immediately. You are falling apart at the seams. You cannot even handle a simple funeral service without having a pathetic mental breakdown." I continued to weep bitterly, burying my face deeply in my scarred hands, rocking back and forth slowly on the hard tiles. "I am sorry," I whispered between manufactured sobs, keeping the red vial pressed safely against my chest beneath my jacket. "I am just so tired, son. I am so terribly tired. Everything is gone, and I do not know what to do." Bradley scoffed loudly, adjusting his expensive gold watch with a quick, arrogant flick of his wrist. His previous panic had vanished entirely, replaced by a smug, suffocating confidence. He truly believed he had won the game. He believed I was completely paralyzed by my grief, entirely oblivious to his horrific crimes. "I am leaving right now," he declared boldly, snatching his luxury car keys off the marble counter. "I have important investors waiting at the firm who actually expect me to conduct business today. I suggest you pull yourself together and sign those revised trust documents by tonight. Do not make me freeze your bank accounts, Dad. I will not warn you again." He did not wait for any sort of response. He marched out of the kitchen with purposeful strides, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. A few seconds later, the heavy front door slammed shut, rattling the glass windows in their frames. I heard the powerful engine of his luxury SUV roar to life, and the loud screech of tires as he sped aggressively out of our driveway. I remained kneeling on the floor until the sound of his vehicle faded completely into the distance. The kitchen fell utterly silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. Slowly, the violent trembling in my shoulders stopped. I lowered my hands from my face and stood up, my old knees popping loudly as I rose to my full height. I wiped the wet tears from my cheeks with the back of my flannel sleeve. The fragile, weeping widower vanished completely, replaced by the hardened diesel mechanic who had spent decades mastering the brutal, unforgiving elements of his trade. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out the tiny red vial, holding it up carefully to the kitchen light. Bradley had made a massive, fatal miscalculation today. He thought my profound grief made me blind. He thought my unconditional parental love made me weak and easily manipulated. He did not realize that a father's love, when brutally betrayed, transforms into a relentless force of absolute destruction. I pocketed the glass vial once more, my mind moving with cold, mechanical precision. The frantic race for the evidence was over. Now it was time to build the iron trap. I kept my calloused hand buried deep inside my jacket pocket the entire drive across town. My thick fingers were wrapped so tightly around that tiny glass vial I was surprised the fragile glass did not shatter against my skin. It felt like I was holding a live explosive, a deadly secret that had already destroyed my world and was waiting to detonate my son's life. The freezing Pennsylvania wind howled against the cracked windshield of my old Ford truck, but the only sound I could hear was the frantic, heavy beating of my own heart. I did not drive toward the local police precinct. Handing over an unmarked vial to a bored desk sergeant without absolute context would guarantee it vanished into an overflowing evidence locker. Worse, Bradley would immediately dispatch his army of expensive corporate lawyers to dismiss it as circumstantial garbage. I needed absolute, undeniable certainty. I needed a scientific name for the exact weapon that stopped the strongest heart I had ever known. I navigated the truck toward a sprawling industrial park on the desolate west side of the county. Tucked between a rusting shipping depot and a massive lumber yard was an independent biochemical testing laboratory. It was owned and operated by a man named Arthur Pendleton. Arthur and I went back more than 20 years. When he was just starting his business and completely bankrupt, I spent 3 weekends rebuilding the blown diesel engine on his family vehicle for free so he could take his kids on vacation. He was a meticulous, brilliant biochemist who owed me a massive favor. More importantly, Arthur was a man who understood loyalty and knew exactly how to keep his mouth shut. I parked the truck and walked into his sterile, brightly lit facility, bringing the heavy scent of motor oil and funeral lilies directly into his pristine office. Arthur looked up from his dual computer monitors, his eyes widening in shock at the sight of my formal suit and the dark, hollow expression on my face. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. I approached his stainless steel counter and placed the tissue-wrapped vial gently onto the cold metal surface. I told him my wife was dead. I told him I needed to know exactly what chemical was hiding inside that glass. I needed the testing done completely off the official books, and I needed the results immediately. Arthur looked at the vial, then looked at the cold, unyielding fire burning in my eyes. He did not ask a single question. He simply nodded, pulled on a pair of thick latex gloves, and picked up the vial with steel precision. He told me a full mass spectrometry scan would take a few hours to isolate the exact compounds. I thanked him, turned on my heel, and marched right back out into the freezing autumn air. I had a few agonizing hours to kill, but I was absolutely not going to spend them pacing in a waiting room. I had a second target to pursue. Catherine's younger sister, Sarah Higgins, lived in a quiet, highly affluent, gated community just 20 minutes south of the industrial park. Sarah was a retired high school administrator, a woman who had spent her entire life carefully curating a perfect public image and maintaining absolute control over her pristine surroundings. But earlier today, standing by the casket at the funeral, I had noticed a glaring crack in her immaculate facade. She was not just mourning her sister. She was consumed by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. Every single time Bradley walked past her pew in his expensive tailored suit, Sarah shrank back into the wooden bench like a cornered animal preparing to be struck. She could not even look my son in the eye. Sarah knew something deeply sinister about Catherine's sudden death, and I was going to tear that secret out of her. I drove my heavy, rusted truck straight into her pristine neighborhood, ignoring the annoyed glares of her wealthy neighbors. I parked roughly against the curb in front of her massive brick home, the heavy tires crushing the very edge of her perfectly manicured lawn. I marched up the long concrete walkway, every heavy step fueled by 30 years of blue-collar grit. I did not press the delicate brass doorbell. I raised my scarred fist and pounded on the heavy oak door until the wood physically rattled against its hinges. Sarah opened the door a full minute later. She was still wearing her black morning dress, her face pale and her eyes swollen from hours of intense weeping. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hand. When she saw me standing on her porch, a towering, furious diesel mechanic with a face made of absolute stone, the remaining color drained entirely from her cheeks. She stammered, trying to offer standard condolences, trying to ask why I was not at the reception receiving guests. But I stepped right past her and crossed the threshold into her grand foyer. I turned around and told her to shut the door. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice a single decibel, but the absolute freezing command in my tone left no room for hesitation. She closed the heavy door, her hands shaking so violently the lock clicked 3 times before engaging. We stood in her quiet, perfectly clean living room. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I looked her dead in the eye and demanded the truth. I told her I knew Catherine did not die of natural heart failure. I told her I knew Bradley was directly involved. Sarah gasped loudly, taking a stumbling step backward. She brought her trembling hands up to cover her mouth, shaking her head wildly. She began to cry, denying everything, claiming my profound grief was making me paranoid and delusional. But I had spent 3 decades diagnosing catastrophic mechanical failures. I knew exactly how a broken system sounded when it was hiding a fatal flaw, and I knew exactly how much pressure to apply to make it crack completely wide open. I stepped closer, my presence filling the room. I told her about the hidden digital voicemail. I told her Catherine went to the trust attorney absolutely terrified for her life. I told her I had just found the hidden poison in my own kitchen and delivered it to a chemical testing lab. The desperate denial instantly evaporated from Sarah's face. The burden of her secret crushed her completely. Her knees simply gave out and she collapsed onto her expensive floral sofa, weeping with an agonizing wail that echoed through the large, empty house. She rocked back and forth on the cushions, sobbing uncontrollably, apologizing to me and to her dead sister over and over again. I did not offer her comfort. I pulled up a heavy wooden dining chair, turned it around, and sat directly in front of her. I told her empty apologies would not bring my wife back from the grave. I needed concrete facts. I needed to know exactly why the boy I had sacrificed my entire life to raise had turned into a cold-blooded monster. Sarah took a ragged, desperate breath, wiping her tear-streaked face with the shredded tissue. She confessed that the nightmare began 6 months ago. Bradley's flashy high-end real estate development firm was a complete illusion. He was not the massive corporate success he pretended to be at family dinners. He had severely over-leveraged his investments, gambling millions of dollars of his clients' capital on a luxury commercial development project that had completely collapsed under zoning violations. He was drowning in toxic corporate debt, facing massive margin calls that threatened to bankrupt his firm and expose him to severe federal fraud charges. He had come to Catherine in secret, begging for a massive financial bailout. But my wife, sensible, grounded, and fiercely protective of the retirement we had built, absolutely refused to let him drain our remaining life savings to cover his criminal negligence. Bradley did not accept her refusal. Sarah explained, her voice dropping into a terrified, shaking whisper that Bradley decided to bypass us entirely. He used his intimate knowledge of our personal finances and his access to our digital records to forge Catherine's signature on a massive corporate bridge loan. He ruthlessly used our fully paid-off home, the property I had built beam by beam with my own hands, and Catherine's comprehensive life insurance policy as direct collateral for a $1.2 million fraudulent transaction. He quietly stole our entire lives with a single stroke of his expensive fountain pen. Catherine only discovered the massive forgery 3 weeks ago. A certified bank notice regarding the collateral had mistakenly arrived in our residential mail instead of being routed to Bradley's corporate office. Sarah said Catherine was absolutely devastated by the betrayal. She called Bradley to the house and confronted him privately, demanding he reverse the fraudulent loan and turn himself in to the authorities immediately. But Bradley did not apologize. He threatened her. He told his own mother that if she exposed the forgery, he would alter the digital records to claim she was a willing co-conspirator. He threatened to drag our entire family into a federal indictment that would leave us penniless and disgraced. But Catherine was a woman of ironclad morals and unbreakable resolve. She refused to be blackmailed by her own son. She told Sarah she was giving Bradley exactly 1 week to confess his crimes to the authorities. If he did not comply, she was going to march straight into the regional FBI field office and hand the federal agents the forged bank documents herself. She died exactly 3 days before her deadline expired. The jagged pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with a sickening, violent crunch. Bradley did not just want to inherit the insurance money early. He committed a calculated, premeditated execution to permanently silence the only witness to his massive financial crimes. He poisoned the woman who gave him life simply to prevent a federal fraud indictment from destroying his luxury lifestyle and his fragile corporate ego. The sheer unfathomable scale of his greed made my stomach violently turn. As I sat in the wooden chair processing the absolute depravity of the monster, I had raised my cell phone began to vibrate aggressively against my chest. The buzzing was a jarring mechanical intrusion in the quiet living room. I reached into my jacket pocket and saw Arthur Pendleton's name flashing on the bright screen. I answered the call immediately, keeping my cold gaze fixed firmly on the weeping woman sitting on the sofa. Arthur's voice came through the speaker, tight, clinical, and completely stripped of any emotion. He told me he had completed the accelerated mass spectrometry scan on the clear liquid inside the vial. He had successfully isolated and identified the active chemical compound. It was a highly concentrated synthetic derivative of digitalis. He explained in a grim tone that it was a rare, nearly untraceable heart-stopping agent. It was specifically engineered to mimic a massive, completely natural cardiac arrest by aggressively binding to the heart muscle and forcing catastrophic failure. It was the perfect murder weapon designed to seamlessly bypass a standard county autopsy unless the medical examiner specifically knew to run a highly specialized toxicology panel. Arthur paused, the heavy silence hanging on the line, and asked me if I wanted him to contact the police department. I told him absolutely not. I instructed him to lock his laboratory doors, secure the glass vial inside his personal wall safe, and speak to absolutely no one about what he had found until I gave the signal. I ended the call and stood up slowly from the chair, my heavy boots planting firmly on the hardwood floor. The final devastating piece of the iron trap had just been handed directly to me. Bradley truly believed he had committed the perfect crime. He arrogantly assumed his massive financial forgery was buried forever in the cold ground alongside his mother. He thought he had outsmarted a tired, uneducated old mechanic. But he was about to learn a brutal lesson about karma. A working-class father who has lost everything, who has been stripped of his wife and betrayed by his own blood, is the most dangerous, unstoppable force on the face of the earth. I turned my back on Sarah Higgins and walked out the front door into the freezing wind. I was going to systematically dismantle my son's life, and I was going to burn his entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. The freezing autumn wind whipping across the manicured lawns of the affluent neighborhood felt like a physical assault as I walked away from the front porch. My heavy work boots crushed the dead leaves scattered across the concrete, the sharp crunching sound breaking the suffocating silence of the evening. I reached my old Ford truck, the metal door handle biting cold against my calloused palm, but I did not open it immediately. I just stood there in the encroaching darkness, my hands gripping the cold steel of the truck bed so hard the metal groaned in protest. The tiny red vial was still burning a hole in my heavy flannel jacket pocket, resting right over my heart like a second toxic heartbeat. The independent laboratory had confirmed it was a synthetic digitalist derivative, a heart-stopping agent. My sister-in-law had just confirmed the motive. A massive forged bridge loan. My own son, the boy I had sacrificed my entire physical body to raise, had deliberately executed his mother to cover up a corporate fraud. The sheer unfathomable depravity of the situation threatened to pull me into a bottomless abyss of grief. I could see Catherine's gentle smile in my mind, remembering how she used to wait up for me after my double shifts at the garage, keeping a plate of food warm in the oven. She had given Bradley unconditional love, and he had repaid her with a calculated chemical death. A raw, guttural growl tore its way up my throat, a sound born of pure, unadulterated hatred. I wanted to drive straight to his high-rise investment firm, drag him out of his custom leather chair by his expensive silk tie, and beat him within an inch of his miserable life. I wanted to feel his arrogant jaw shatter under my heavy fists. I wanted to make him feel a fraction of the agony he had inflicted upon his mother in her final moments. But the man who had spent 3 decades mastering the brutal mechanics of diesel engines knew that uncontrolled explosions only destroyed the containment vessel. I needed absolute surgical precision. If I drove to the police station right now and threw that tiny glass vial onto a detective's desk, I would be making a catastrophic tactical error. Bradley was an investment broker who managed millions of dollars for wealthy clients. He had an entire army of ruthless, high-priced corporate defense attorneys on retainer. Those men wore custom suits and possessed the moral compass of starving sharks. I could perfectly envision the legal defense they would manufacture in a courtroom. They would claim I was a grieving, delusional old man who had planted the vial in a desperate attempt to find a scapegoat for my wife's natural passing. Or worse, they would spin a sickening narrative that Catherine had been severely depressed about her failing health and had acquired the digitalis herself to commit suicide, framing the forged loan as a desperate act of a dying woman trying to save her son. They would drown the county prosecutor in endless motions, reasonable doubt, and fabricated alternative theories until Bradley walked out of the courtroom a free, wealthy man. I could not allow that to happen. The vial was the murder weapon, and the confession was the motive, but I was still missing the critical ignition spark. I needed the transaction. I needed the undeniable digital footprint that tied Bradley's pristine hands directly to the acquisition of that deadly chemical. I needed the receipt for his mother's murder. I released my grip on the truck and marched right back up the long concrete walkway. I did not bother knocking this time. I turned the heavy brass handle and let myself back in, pushing the heavy oak door shut behind me with a solid thud. Sarah was still sitting on the expensive floral sofa in her grand foyer, clutching a damp tissue in her trembling hands, her eyes swollen and red from weeping. She looked up at me with a mixture of terror and profound sorrow. "Get up!" I commanded, my voice stripping away any room for argument or hesitation. "Weep later. Right now, I need your computer and I need the passwords to the family trust server." Sarah blinked rapidly, wiping her tear-streaked face with the shredded tissue. "Silas, what are you talking about? What are you going to do?" "I am going to find out exactly where he bought the poison." I stated coldly, walking past her into her pristine home office. Bradley is arrogant, but he is also a creature of habit. He lives in a world of digital transfers, encrypted emails, and complex ledgers. He did not brew that toxin in a bathtub. He purchased it from a professional, and professionals always leave a paper trail. Sarah followed me nervously into the office. A room lined with expensive mahogany bookshelves and a sleek silver desktop computer sitting on a glass desk. She sat down in the leather chair, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type her own login credentials. The family joint server was a secure cloud network Bradley had set up 2 years ago, allegedly to streamline the sharing of tax documents, estate planning files, and Catherine's medical records. He had convinced us it was the safest way to manage our collective assets in the modern age. In reality, it was the perfect camouflage for his massive financial fraud, a place where he could manipulate numbers right under our noses. I pulled up a heavy wooden chair and sat directly beside her. My hands were massive, scarred, and permanently stained with engine grease, a stark contrast to the pristine white keyboard and the glowing high-resolution screen. I was not a software engineer. I did not know how to write code or hack into secure government databases. But I possessed something far more dangerous. I possessed the methodical, relentless diagnostic mind of a master mechanic. When a massive diesel engine fails, you do not just stare at the metal block and guess. You trace the fuel lines, you check the electrical harnesses, you look for the minute pressure drops and the hidden leaks. You isolate the systems one by one until the catastrophic failure reveals itself. I was going to apply that exact same brutal logic to my son's digital life. Open the financial directories, I instructed, leaning closer to the bright monitor. Pull up every single business expense, every consulting fee, and every private transfer he made over the last 8 months. Leave nothing hidden. Sarah navigated through the complex maze of folders with trembling fingers. The screen filled with endless spreadsheets, bank statements, and corporate invoices. The sheer volume of data was designed to overwhelm any casual observer hiding his sins in an ocean of numbers. But I was not looking at the numbers themselves. I was looking for the anomaly. I was looking for the gear that did not belong in the transmission. We spent 3 agonizing hours staring at that glowing screen. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked rhythmically, counting down the seconds as we sifted through Bradley's lavish, disgusting lifestyle. I watched as he transferred thousands of dollars to luxury car dealerships, high-end restaurants, and exclusive golf clubs, all while my wife was meticulously budgeting her grocery money at home. My blood pressure spiked with every click of the mouse, but I forced my rage down, locking it away in a dark vault in my mind. I had to remain entirely objective. I had to find the leak. "Stop," I said sharply, my calloused finger tapping the glass screen hard enough to make it vibrate. "Go back to that last spreadsheet. The one labeled independent contracting fees for the new real estate development." Sarah clicked back, opening a heavily encrypted ledger that she had managed to unlock using a backdoor password Catherine had written down months ago. The ledger listed a series of monthly payments, supposedly for environmental consulting on his failed commercial project. The amounts were relatively small, consistent, and perfectly disguised as standard operational costs. But there was one entry dated exactly 5 weeks before Catherine's sudden death that stood out like a cracked piston. It was a massive lump sum transfer of $25,000. The recipient was not listed as a corporate consulting firm or a standard contractor. It was listed under a private abbreviated liability company called JV Medical Consulting. "Who is JV?" I muttered, my eyes narrowing at the glowing text on the screen. "Bradley is a real estate developer. He builds luxury condos. He does not hire medical consultants for any reason." Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the company registration through a public state database. Her breath hitched sharply in her throat as the search results populated the screen. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling with fresh horror. JV stands for Julian Vance. The name meant nothing to me at first, but Sarah immediately opened a new browser window and typed the name into a search engine. The screen instantly filled with news articles, state medical board disciplinary records, and local police blotters from 5 years ago. Dr. Julian Vance was not a legitimate medical consultant. He was a disgraced former pharmacist who had been stripped of his state medical license and narrowly avoided a federal prison sentence for operating a massive illegal prescription pill mill. He had been caught funneling highly addictive narcotics to wealthy suburbanites using his pharmaceutical knowledge to manufacture untraceable synthetic compounds for private buyers. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. Bradley had not just bought a poison from a random street dealer. He had hired a disgraced criminal chemist to manufacture a custom untraceable heart-stopping agent. He had paid $25,000 of stolen family money to orchestrate the perfect execution. Dig deeper, I commanded, my voice dropping into a dangerous gravelly register that echoed in the quiet room. Check the joint email server. See if there is a shadow account linked to these transfers. Bradley is too arrogant to conduct this kind of business without leaving a safety net or a digital receipt. Sarah navigated back to the family server, her eyes scanning the complex directory trees with desperate speed. She found a hidden nested folder disguised as a routine software update file. It was locked behind a secondary firewall, but Sarah used Catherine's master administrative override to pry it open. Inside was a cache of heavily encrypted emails sent from a burner address directly to Julian Vance's private server. We opened the first email dated 6 weeks prior to the funeral. The subject line was completely blank. The text was short, clinical, and completely devoid of any human emotion or hesitation. I need a permanent solution for an aging heart. It must mimic natural failure. No residual chemical markers can be left behind. Autopsy must show standard cardiac arrest. Money is not an object. Proceed immediately. I felt a freezing, paralyzing wave of nausea wash over my entire body. I was reading my son's explicit instructions for the execution of my wife. He had negotiated her death like a common business transaction, demanding a clean job to protect his precious corporate reputation. The subsequent emails detailed the payment structure, the delivery method, and finally a terrifying message from the disgraced pharmacist confirming the completion of the synthetic digitalis derivative. The formula is highly concentrated and perfectly stabilized, Vance had written in his final message. Administer a single red vial in a warm liquid to ensure rapid absorption into the bloodstream. Total cardiac failure will occur within hours. Do not alter the dosage under any circumstances. The red vial, the exact object currently resting against my chest. The circle was completely closed. The iron trap was fully assembled and ready to snap shut. We had the motive, the murder weapon, the financial transaction, and the explicit written confession of conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. Sarah pushed her chair back from the glass desk, covering her mouth with both hands to stifle a terrified sob. He really did it, she wept, her voice muffled and broken. He paid a monster to kill my sister so he could keep his fancy suits and his sports cars. I did not weep. The time for weeping had ended hours ago on the cold tiles of my kitchen floor. I stared at the glowing monitor, memorizing the exact address listed on Julian Vance's illegal company registration. It was an abandoned commercial property on the far edge of the industrial district, a dilapidated warehouse complex that the city had ignored for years. It was the perfect place for a disgraced pharmacist to operate a shadow laboratory far away from the eyes of the law. I stood up slowly, my heavy work boots planting firmly on the hardwood floor. The exhaustion of the day vanished completely, replaced by an unlimited reservoir of adrenaline and absolute unyielding resolve. Print every single one of those emails, I ordered, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. Print the financial ledgers, the wire transfer receipts, and the company registration documents. Make 3 separate physical copies right now. Lock 1 set in your personal floor safe. Give 1 set to Attorney Thomas Wright first thing tomorrow morning, and keep the final set ready for the federal investigators when the time comes. Silas, where are you going? Sarah asked, her voice rising in sheer panic as she watched me button my heavy flannel jacket to the top. You need to call the police right now. We have all the proof. You have to let the detectives handle this before someone else gets hurt. I turned to look at my sister-in-law. My face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. The police play by a very specific set of rules, Sarah. They require warrants, they conduct polite interviews, and they give men like Bradley the opportunity to lawyer up and destroy the remaining evidence. If I hand this file to a detective tonight, Julian Vance will be on a private flight out of the country before the sun comes up, and Bradley will simply claim his digital accounts were hacked by an unknown third party. I reached out and gently patted Sarah on the shoulder with my scarred hand. I need an absolute airtight confession from the man who manufactured the weapon. I need Vance to physically hand over his own personal ledgers to prove he received the blood money directly from Bradley. And Vance is a hardened criminal. He will not hand that kind of damning evidence over to a polite detective with a shiny badge. I turned my back on the pristine home office and walked down the grand hallway toward the front door. I cracked my knuckles, the thick, swollen joints popping loudly in the quiet house. I had spent 30 years wrestling 1,000-pound engine blocks back into alignment. I had dragged overturned commercial rigs out of frozen ditches with my bare hands. I possessed a kind of raw physical blue-collar strength that men who worked in laboratories and glass corporate towers simply could not comprehend. I was not going to ask Julian Vance politely for his cooperation. I was going to walk into his illegal pill mill in the dead of night, and I was going to apply the exact amount of terrifying physical pressure required to make his entire criminal enterprise crack wide open. I stepped out onto the front porch, the freezing autumn wind howling through the dark suburban streets, and walked toward my old Ford truck. The hunt for the accomplice had officially begun. The industrial district on the far western edge of the county was a graveyard of rusted metal, crumbling concrete, and forgotten ambitions. It was the kind of desolate place that decent people avoided long before the sun went down. I parked my old Ford truck 2 blocks away from the address Sarah had pulled from the encrypted family server. The freezing autumn wind whipped through the abandoned streets, rattling loose chain-link fences and howling through the shattered windows of empty warehouses. I pulled the collar of my heavy canvas jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling the biting cold sink into my aching joints. The tiny red vial was safely locked away inside my truck, but its heavy toxic weight still pressed relentlessly on my mind. My own son, the boy I had spent a lifetime protecting, had paid a disgraced pharmacist $25,000 to manufacture a heart-stopping poison. Now I was walking into the darkness to collect the final receipt for my wife's murder. I moved silently through the deep shadows, my heavy work boots stepping carefully to avoid the jagged pieces of glass and rusted scrap metal littering the cracked pavement. Julian Vance operated his illegal pill mill out of a dilapidated auto body shop that looked entirely condemned from the main road. The front windows were boarded up with rotting plywood, and the exterior walls were covered in years of faded graffiti. But a master mechanic knows exactly how to read the hidden systems of a building. I noticed the heavy-duty commercial air extractor spinning quietly on the reinforced roof, venting toxic chemical fumes into the night sky. I saw the faint sliver of artificial fluorescent light bleeding from beneath the heavy corrugated steel garage door at the back of the property. Vance was inside brewing his synthetic poisons, completely unaware that a grieving, furious husband was standing right outside his walls. I did not bother knocking on the front door. I walked around to the dark side alley where the main electrical box was mounted against the crumbling brick wall. The metal panel was secured by a cheap commercial padlock. I gripped the steel lock with my thick, calloused hands, wedged the heavy head of my steel wrench into the shackle, and applied a sudden violent twist. The metal snapped with a sharp crack that was instantly swallowed by the howling wind. I opened the panel, studying the complex wiring. I did not cut the main power just yet. First, I needed to make absolutely sure the rat could not escape the trap. I moved stealthily to the rear loading bay. The heavy corrugated steel doors were operated by an exterior chain hoist mechanism. I pulled a thick length of heavy logging chain from my jacket pocket, wrapped it tightly around the main drive gear of the door, and secured it with a massive steel padlock of my own. That door was not opening unless someone brought an industrial cutting torch. I found a side entry door near the loading dock. It was secured by a standard deadbolt, but the wooden frame around the lock was completely rotten from years of severe water damage and neglect. I planted my heavy work boot firmly against the wood right next to the locking mechanism. The door splintered and gave way with a loud, satisfying crunch, swinging inward. I stepped into the dimly lit corridor and closed the broken door behind me, leaning a heavy steel pipe against the handle to keep it shut. The air inside the building was thick and suffocating, smelling strongly of rubbing alcohol, burnt sulfur, and harsh synthetic chemicals. It was the foul scent of death being manufactured for profit. I moved down the narrow hallway with the silent, heavy grace of a man who had spent decades navigating crowded, highly dangerous garage floors. At the end of the hall, a wide set of double doors led directly into the main workshop. I peered cautiously through the dirty glass window. The large garage space had been entirely converted into a makeshift biochemical laboratory. Long stainless steel tables were covered in glass beakers, digital scales, Bunsen burners, and endless rows of unmarked pill bottles. Standing in the center of the room, under a bank of blindingly bright fluorescent lights, was Julian Vance. He was a thin, nervous-looking man in his early 50s wearing a stained white lab coat over expensive tailored dress clothes. He was hunched over a steel counter, carefully transferring a clear liquid into a row of tiny glass vials using a medical-grade syringe. They were red vials, the exact same kind that had forcefully stopped my beautiful Catherine's heart. A primal burning rage flared deep in my chest. I wanted to smash through those wooden doors, wrap my scarred, grease-stained hands around his throat, and squeeze until his eyes rolled back in his head. I wanted to make him feel the exact agonizing pain he had bottled and sold to my son. But anger without calculation is just useless noise. I needed him terrified, broken, and completely compliant. I walked slowly back down the hallway to the main electrical breaker box I had exposed earlier. I grabbed the heavy main switch and yanked it down with violent force. The loud mechanical clunk echoed ominously through the empty building. The bright fluorescent lights in the laboratory instantly died, plunging the entire warehouse into absolute suffocating darkness. The constant droning hum of the ventilation fans spun down into a heavy silence. From the laboratory, I heard the sharp sound of shattering glass as Vance dropped a beaker in his sudden panic. He cursed loudly, his voice trembling with immediate uncontrolled fear. I stepped into the laboratory, my eyes already adjusting perfectly to the pitch-black room. The only illumination came from the pale moonlight filtering through a single dirty skylight high above the concrete floor. I stood perfectly still in the deep shadows, letting the absolute silence terrify him before I made my move. "Who is there?" Vance shouted, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He was scrambling blindly in the dark, knocking over plastic trays and heavy metal tools. "I said who is in here with me. I have a weapon and I am armed." He was lying. A man holding a deadly weapon does not stumble backward into a stainless steel counter in terror. I walked slowly across the concrete floor. My heavy boots made a deliberate, terrifying thud, with every single step echoing loudly in the cavernous space. Vance panicked and tried to run toward the rear garage doors. I heard him frantically pulling on the manual chain hoist, grunting with heavy physical exertion, but the logging chain I had wrapped securely around the exterior gears held firm. The heavy steel door did not budge a single inch. "You are not leaving, Doctor," I said. My voice was a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the freezing cold air of the warehouse. Vance spun around, pressing his back flat against the cold, corrugated steel door. He pulled a small tactical flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on. The narrow, blinding beam of light swept frantically across the room until it finally hit my face. I did not blink. I did not raise a hand to shield my eyes. I simply stood there, a towering diesel mechanic with a face made of cold, unyielding stone staring directly into his soul. "What do you want?" Vance stammered, shining the bright light directly into my eyes.
His hand was shaking so badly the beam danced across the ceiling. "Take whatever you want. There is cash in the desk drawer. Take the pills. Take the equipment. Just get out of here and leave me alone."
I did not want his dirty money. I lunged forward with a sudden explosive speed that he clearly did not expect from a man my age. I grabbed him violently by the lapels of his white coat and slammed him backward against the heavy steel door. The brutal impact knocked the flashlight from his weak grip. It clattered onto the concrete floor, rolling away and casting long, distorted shadows across the laboratory walls. I pinned him against the freezing metal, my thick forearm pressing hard against his collarbone. I applied just enough physical pressure to let him know I could snap him in half if I chose to. "My name is Silas Croft," I whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee and sheer terror radiating from his breath. "You sold a highly concentrated digitalis derivative to a man named Bradley Croft. He used it to brutally murder my wife. And now you are going to give me the exact receipt for that transaction." Vance gasped for air, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He tried to squirm out of my iron grip, but he was a frail, soft chemist wrestling with a man who had spent a lifetime lifting 1,000-pound engine blocks. I tightened my hold, pressing him even harder against the unforgiving steel door until he whimpered in pain. "I do not know what you are talking about." Vance choked out sputters of desperate saliva hitting my canvas jacket. "I am just a private medical consultant. I do not sell anything illegal. You have the wrong man. Please let me go before you do something you regret." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply shifted my weight, bringing my free, heavily scarred hand up to grip his throat. I did not squeeze hard enough to cut off his airway entirely, just enough to let him feel the brutal absolute strength in my calloused fingers. "Do not insult my intelligence, Julian," I said coldly. "I have the encrypted emails you sent him. I know about the $25,000 wire transfer from his fake real estate consulting firm. I have the red vial, and I have an independent biochemical lab report confirming exactly what lethal poison was hidden inside it. The police do not know yet. Right now it is just you and me in the dark. If you lie to me again, I will not call the cops. I will simply tear this building down around you and bury you under the rubble." The terrifying reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was trapped in an abandoned warehouse with a grieving, furious husband who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The weak, cowardly nature of his character broke completely under the extreme pressure. He began to sob, his entire body trembling violently against the metal door. Okay, he wept, raising his hands in a desperate gesture of total surrender. "I did it. I sold it to him. But I did not know he was going to use it on his own mother. I swear to God I did not know. He just said he needed a clean solution for an elderly problem. He said it was for a wealthy client who wanted a painless exit. I just manufacture the compounds. I do not ask questions." "You do not ask questions when someone pays you $25,000 to manufacture an untraceable heart-stopping poison." I demanded, completely disgusted by his pathetic attempt to avoid responsibility. "Where is the ledger? I know you kept a record. A rat like you always keeps a blackmail file to protect yourself from your own wealthy clients. Give it to me right now." Vance nodded frantically, pointing a shaking finger toward a heavy metal desk sitting in the corner of the laboratory. "It is in the laptop, the black laptop in the bottom locked drawer. It is fully encrypted, but I can unlock it for you. I have all the transaction dates, the chemical formulas, the delivery locations, and the wire receipts. Everything is there. Just please do not hurt me." I dragged him by the collar across the dark laboratory, kicking a rolling medical stool violently out of the way. I forced him down into the leather chair behind the desk and ordered him to open the drawer. He fumbled in the dark, pulling out a sleek black laptop. He opened the screen, the bright artificial glow illuminating his pale, sweating, terrified face. His trembling fingers typed a complex password into the security prompt. The screen unlocked, revealing a meticulous digital ledger detailing his entire illegal pharmaceutical empire. I leaned over his shoulder, my heavy hand resting menacingly on the back of his neck to ensure he did not try anything foolish. "Open the specific file for Bradley Croft," I commanded. He quickly navigated to a hidden folder and opened a detailed financial spreadsheet. There it was. The absolute, undeniable proof. The ledger showed the exact date the money was wired, the date the digitalis derivative was manufactured, and the date he physically handed the red vials to my son in a parking garage downtown. It was the final inescapable nail in Bradley's coffin.
"Print it," I said, pointing at the small laser printer resting on the corner of the desk.
"Print every single page and copy the entire hard drive onto a portable disk. Do not miss a single file." As Vance frantically clicked the commands to transfer the files, he kept babbling desperately,
trying to buy my mercy by throwing my son entirely under the bus. "I will give you everything, Mr. Croft. I will testify against him in federal court if you want. He is a monster. He is completely crazy. He even contacted me yesterday on the encrypted server asking for a rush order." I froze. The cold air in the room suddenly felt heavy and suffocating. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. Vance looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear, realizing he had just stumbled into something far darker than he anticipated. "He messaged me yesterday. He said the first dose worked perfectly and left absolutely no trace. He said he needed to accelerate his timeline because of a massive financial emergency. He paid another $10,000 as a rush fee." "A rush fee for what?" I demanded, my grip tightening on his shoulder until he winced. "For a second dose," Vance stammered, shrinking away from my heavy hand. "He ordered a second batch of the digitalis derivative. He said he had another sudden heart failure to arrange before the end of the month. He wanted it ready by this weekend." The horrifying realization hit me with the devastating physical force of a runaway freight train. The forged bridge loan. The massive corporate debt. Bradley had murdered his mother to stop her from exposing him to the federal authorities. But Catherine's death did not magically erase the forged signatures. It did not give him full access to the life insurance money immediately. The estate was still entirely in my name. I was the surviving spouse. The only way Bradley could gain instant, unquestioned control over all the family assets and bury the financial fraud forever was if I died too. The second dose was meant for me. My own son was planning to murder me to finish his hostile takeover of our lives. He wanted me out of the way so he could liquidate the house and the retirement accounts without a single question asked. I looked down at the disgraced pharmacist, the printer humming quietly in the dark laboratory, spitting out the physical pages of my son's ultimate betrayal. Bradley thought he was hunting a weak, oblivious, grieving old man. He had no idea that I was already standing right behind him with an iron trap wide open and waiting. I drove away from the abandoned warehouse district with the portable hard drive resting heavy in my jacket pocket, right next to the glass vial of poison. The freezing autumn wind battered the rusted sides of my old Ford truck, howling through the dark, empty streets, but inside the cab, the atmosphere was completely still. I had everything I needed. I had the physical murder weapon. I had the encrypted financial ledgers. I had the explicit written confession from a disgraced pharmacist who was currently sitting in the dark, terrified out of his mind. But having the raw evidence was only half the battle. If I simply handed this file over to the local police right now, Bradley would hide behind a massive wall of expensive corporate defense lawyers. He would leverage his stolen wealth to drag the legal proceedings out for years, manipulating the system to protect his fragile ego. I did not want a quiet settlement, a delayed trial, or a comfortable plea deal behind closed doors. I wanted absolute, devastating public annihilation. I wanted the arrogant, murderous facade he wore so proudly to be shattered into a million irreversible pieces in front of everyone he was desperately trying to impress. To catch a ruthless predator, you have to play the part of the wounded, helpless prey. The next morning, I sat alone at my worn kitchen table, staring blankly at my cell phone. The house was painfully quiet without Catherine. Her empty floral armchair across from me felt like a massive physical weight pressing down heavily on my chest. I took a deep, ragged breath, channeling every single ounce of the crushing exhaustion and profound grief I was genuinely feeling, and dialed my son's personal number. He answered on the third ring.
The background noise on his end was loud, filled with the clinking of expensive crystal glassware and the arrogant booming laughter of men in tailored suits. He was likely at some exclusive country club buying drinks with my stolen money, celebrating his presumed victory, while his mother was barely cold in the ground.
"What is it, Dad?" Bradley answered, his tone dripping with severe impatience and absolute condescension. "I am in the middle of a very important networking lunch with international clients. I thought I made it explicitly clear at the church that you need to sign those revised trust documents by the end of the day."
I let my voice crack intentionally. I allowed my broad shoulders to slump forward, even though he could not see me physically adopting the posture of a completely broken, defeated old man who had nothing left to fight for. "I know, son," I whispered, making sure my breathing sounded incredibly ragged and weak over the line. "I know you did. I am just calling to tell you that you win the fight. I cannot battle you anymore. I am just too tired to manage it all, son. The house maintenance, the massive retirement accounts, the complex life insurance policies. It is all just too heavy and confusing without your mother here to help me. I do not have the physical strength left to deal with the banks or the aggressive lawyers. I will sign whatever documents you need me to sign. I just want to hand it over and be left alone in the quiet to grieve." There was a brief, highly loaded silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears turning in his greedy, calculating mind. The complete, unconditional surrender was exactly what his massive, fragile ego demanded. He truly believed his psychological torture at the funeral casket had broken my spirit entirely. He believed he had successfully bullied a grieving, uneducated blue-collar mechanic into handing over a lifetime of hard-earned assets without a single legal fight. "Well," Bradley said, his voice suddenly smoothing out into a sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone that made my stomach violently turn. "I am glad you are finally seeing reason, Dad. It is the best decision for everyone involved. Mom wanted me to take the financial reins because she knew you could not handle it. I will make sure you are taken care of in a small, affordable assisted living apartment once we fully liquidate the property." "Thank you, Bradley," I choked out, forcing a fake, desperate sob into the back of my throat. "Where do you want me to bring the paperwork?" Bradley was a man pathologically obsessed with public appearances. He did not just want the money to cover his fraudulent debts. He wanted the glory of the corporate acquisition. He wanted to parade his newly acquired wealth in front of his peers to prove he was a heavy hitter in the ruthless financial world. "Do not come to the house," he instructed briskly, his voice raising slightly so his lunch guests could hear him closing a deal. "I want to do this officially properly and legally binding. Come to my investment firm downtown tomorrow afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock. We will use the main executive glass boardroom. I will have the final transfer documents printed, notarized, and ready for your signature." "Okay, son. I will be there." I hung up the phone, and the fragile, weeping widower vanished instantly into thin air. My face hardened into solid, unyielding stone. The iron trap was officially baited. Bradley simply could not resist the overwhelming temptation to turn his hostile takeover of our family estate into a massive corporate spectacle. Over the next few hours, I received a series of automated digital calendar invitations forwarded to my email address. He was not just planning a quiet private meeting between a father and a son to settle an estate. He was actively turning my emotional surrender into a massive public relations event for his failing company. He had formally invited his wealthy father-in-law, a ruthless man who owned a string of luxury car dealerships and provided the initial seed money for Bradley's firm. He invited his senior board partners, the very men who were aggressively demanding the margin calls he was desperately trying to cover with Catherine's life insurance payout. He even invited his lead corporate investors. He was going to use my life savings, the home I built with my own hands, and my dead wife's blood money to falsely inflate his corporate portfolio and impress his high society circle. He wanted a grand stage to display his power. I was going to give him a public execution block. I left my empty house and drove straight to the private law office of Thomas Wright. The seasoned, usually unflappable family attorney was pacing nervously behind his heavy mahogany desk when I walked through the door. I did not say a single word. I simply reached into my heavy jacket and placed the portable hard drive, the freshly printed financial ledgers from the pill mill, and the tiny red glass vial of digitalis derivative directly onto the center of his polished desk. Thomas stopped his pacing immediately. He stared down at the physical evidence, his face turning a sickening ash-gray color as he realized the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the horror my son had orchestrated. I explained exactly how I had acquired the poison, how I had tracked down the disgraced pharmacist in the dead of night, and how Bradley had confidently ordered a second rush dose specifically designed to stop my heart before the end of the current month. Thomas sank heavily into his expensive leather chair, removing his reading glasses and rubbing his trembling temples.
Silas, this is not just grand larceny, embezzlement, and wire fraud anymore. This is a premeditated, highly coordinated assassination plot. We have to bring the federal authorities into this room right now. I have a close trusted colleague, a senior investigator with the FBI's Financial Crimes and Major Felony Division. He needs to see this evidence immediately.
"Bring him in," I commanded, leaning my heavy frame over the desk with absolute unwavering authority. "But we are absolutely not arresting Bradley quietly at his suburban house in the middle of the night. He is hosting a massive signing event tomorrow at 2 o'clock in his corporate boardroom. He is bringing all his wealthy investors, his board partners, and his father-in-law to watch him take total control of my estate. That is exactly where we cut off the head of the snake. I want every single person in his professional and personal life to watch his fraudulent empire burn to ash." Thomas looked up at me, seeing the freezing, unyielding fire burning in my eyes, and slowly nodded his head. He picked up his secure office phone and made the call. Less than an hour later, Special Agent David Vance arrived at the law office. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with cold, highly analytical eyes and a quiet demeanor that perfectly mirrored my own relentless focus. He did not waste precious time with empty condolences or pity. He immediately plugged the portable hard drive into a secure federal laptop. He reviewed the encrypted burner emails ordering the poison, verified the massive offshore financial transfers, and listened to Catherine's agonizing, rattling voicemail from the grave. When he finished his review, he closed the laptop with a sharp, echoing snap. "Your son is a highly dangerous monster, Mr. Croft. He has constructed a massive, fragile house of cards built entirely on federal wire fraud, identity theft, and first-degree murder. But you are absolutely correct regarding the tactical approach. If we arrest him right now based on this, his defense team will claim the digital evidence was illegally planted and try to suppress the pharmacist's coerced confession. We need him to openly and arrogantly acknowledge the transfer of the stolen assets in front of credible witnesses. We need to catch him in the exact moment he attempts to finalize the extortion. He wants me to sign the entire estate over at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon," I said, my voice vibrating with a dangerous, heavy calm. "I am going to walk into that glass-walled boardroom. I am going to look my son dead in the eye, and I am going to tear his entire life apart piece by piece." Agent Vance outlined the tactical federal strategy with strict military precision. We were not just going to secretly record the meeting. We were going to build a cinematic, inescapable digital trap. He immediately dispatched a covert technical surveillance team to Bradley's downtown investment firm under the strict guise of routine building HVAC maintenance. Working silently through the night, the federal agents infiltrated the executive boardroom, carefully replacing the standard ceiling smoke detectors and wall thermostat covers with high-definition wide-angle hidden cameras and highly sensitive audio transmitters. Every square inch of that polished mahogany table was now under active federal surveillance, but we needed an absolute fail-safe. We needed to ensure that every single word Bradley spoke, every arrogant whispered threat he made to force my physical signature was captured perfectly, even if he pulled me into a quiet corner of the room to intimidate me. The next morning, I stood perfectly still in Thomas Wright's office as Agent Vance carefully taped a sophisticated ultra-thin federal microphone directly to the center of my chest, meticulously hiding the small transmitter battery pack deep in the interior lining of my heavy flannel jacket. The cold medical adhesive pulled uncomfortably at my skin, a sharp, constant physical reminder of the deadly high-stakes game I was preparing to play. I was a union diesel mechanic. I was used to wearing heavy canvas, thick grease, and steel-toed work boots. Now I was wearing classified federal surveillance equipment, preparing to walk directly into a den of ruthless corporate wolves. "The microphone is completely live and transmitting securely," Agent Vance stated firmly, checking the scrolling audio feed on his encrypted digital tablet. "Mr. Croft, you need to deeply understand the extreme psychological volatility of this specific situation. Your son truly believes he has won the war. When you suddenly refuse to sign those transfer documents and reveal that you know about the murder, his psychological profile heavily suggests he will experience a catastrophic mental break. He is incredibly desperate. He has already killed his own mother to protect this massive fraud, and he has explicitly purchased the chemical weapon to kill you next. You are walking into a highly confined space with a cornered, deadly predator. I have spent my entire adult life wrestling 1,000-pound diesel machines that could easily crush my skull in a split second," I replied calmly, carefully buttoning my thick flannel jacket completely over the hidden wire. "I know exactly how to handle a catastrophic mechanical failure. You just make absolutely sure your armed agents are ready to breach those doors when I drop the hammer." Thomas Wright packed his battered leather briefcase, placing a certified encrypted copy of Catherine's hidden audio file and the official biochemical laboratory report safely inside the main compartment. He looked at me with a complex mixture of deep sorrow and profound, unwavering respect. "Silas, your wife, was an incredibly brave and brilliant woman. She gave her own life to gather the initial crucial threads of this horrific conspiracy. Today, we finish exactly what she started. We are going to ensure that Bradley Croft never sees the outside of a federal concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. We do not just send him to a quiet prison cell, Thomas," I said, my voice cold, heavy, and hard as forged steel. "We destroy his entire corporate reputation. We humiliate him brutally in front of the wealthy father-in-law he worships. We aggressively strip away every single ounce of his false stolen wealth and leave him absolutely naked and ruined in front of the entire world." I checked my worn wristwatch. It was exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. The agonizing time for silent, careful preparation was completely over. The frantic race to secure the undeniable evidence was finished. I walked out of the law office and climbed into the cold cab of my old Ford truck. I did not turn on the radio. I drove through the bustling, noisy downtown city streets in absolute heavy silence, feeling the toxic weight of the red vial in my right pocket and the cold metal of the federal wire pressed tightly against my beating heart. I parked down the street from the towering, sleek glass skyscraper that housed Bradley's luxury investment firm. I sat in the truck for one final quiet minute, closing my tired eyes and picturing Catherine's beautiful, gentle smile. I asked her for the unyielding strength to maintain my absolute composure, to firmly hold back the violent primal rage that desperately wanted to tear my son apart with my bare, calloused hands. I needed to be entirely cold. I needed to be flawlessly calculated. I needed to execute this final trap with the exact precision of a master mechanic aligning a massive, complex engine block. I opened my eyes, the heavy sorrow entirely replaced by a freezing, unyielding resolve that pumped like ice water through my veins. I stepped out of the rusted truck, my heavy work boots hitting the concrete pavement with loud, purposeful thuds. I walked through the massive revolving glass doors of the towering corporate building, completely ignoring the strange, judgmental looks from the sharply dressed security guards in the lobby. I was a working-class father, permanently scarred by decades of brutal physical labor, walking into a pristine palace of stolen, bloody wealth. But I was not walking in as a broken victim. I was walking in as the ruthless architect of my son's absolute destruction. The fake surrender was fully in motion, the players were assembling, and the final devastating curtain was about to rise. The elevator doors slid shut behind me, sealing me inside a polished steel box that shot upward into the towering heights of the downtown financial district. My heavy work boots, scuffed and permanently stained with decades of diesel grease, felt entirely alien on the pristine marble floor. I was wearing my thick canvas work pants and a faded flannel shirt, a stark and deliberate contrast to the world I was infiltrating. Beneath the heavy fabric of my jacket, the cold medical adhesive holding the federal transmitter to my chest pulled sharply against my skin with every breath I took. It was a constant physical reminder that I was no longer just a grieving widower. I was the architect of my son's absolute destruction. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing the rhythm of a failing engine, but my mind was completely cold and clear. I had spent 40 years navigating 1,000-pound rigs down treacherous icy mountain passes, where a single mistake meant falling into a deep abyss. Walking into this corporate skyscraper was no different. I knew exactly how to navigate this treacherous road. I just had to keep my hands steady on the wheel. The elevator chimed a soft, artificial note and the doors opened onto the 50th floor. The reception area was a vast expanse of gleaming white tile frosted glass and brushed steel. A young woman sitting behind a massive curved desk looked up at me. Her professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she took in my rough appearance. I did not belong here. This was a palace built on stolen money, forged signatures, and the blood of the woman I loved. I walked heavily toward her, letting my boots thud loudly against the floor. I told her my name was Silas Croft and that I was here to see my son. She nodded quickly, tapping on her computer, and pointed a manicured finger toward a set of heavy glass doors at the end of a long corridor. I walked down that hallway with the slow, deliberate pace of a man walking to an execution. The walls were lined with abstract modern art and framed photographs of luxury real estate developments, the very projects Bradley had used to sink his firm into a massive fraudulent debt. I reached the executive boardroom and placed my calloused hand on the thick glass door. I took one final deep breath, burying the hardened mechanic deep inside and pulling the frail, broken, exhausted father to the surface. I pushed the door open and stepped into the viper's nest. The boardroom was spectacular and entirely suffocating. A massive mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by plush leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, arrogant view of the city skyline, but I was not looking at the view. I was looking at the vultures gathered around the table. Bradley was standing at the head of the table wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that fit him with predatory perfection. His hair was impeccably styled. His gold watch caught the afternoon sunlight. He looked like the absolute picture of a successful, grieving son bravely holding his family together. Gathered around him were the men he was so desperate to impress. I recognized his wealthy father-in-law, Richard, a man with a thick neck, an expensive gray suit, and the aggressive posture of a man who owned a string of highly profitable car dealerships. Richard had provided the initial capital for Bradley's firm, and Bradley was terrified of him. Sitting next to Richard were 3 senior board partners, older men with cold eyes and calculated smiles. These were the investors Bradley had to appease the men demanding the margin calls that had driven my son to murder his own mother. When the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, all conversation in the room stopped instantly. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. I immediately let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly at my sides. I lowered my gaze, playing the part of a man entirely crushed by the weight of his grief and the overwhelming complexities of the financial world. Bradley stepped forward immediately, his face twisting into a mask of profound artificial sympathy. He crossed the room and placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. The physical contact made my stomach violently churn, but I forced myself to lean into his touch as if I were relying on him for support. "Thank you for coming, Dad," Bradley said, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet sincerity designed entirely for the audience watching us. "I know this is incredibly difficult for you. I know you are exhausted, but we are going to get this all sorted out today so you can finally go home and rest." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the polished mahogany floor. "I am just so tired, son," I whispered, making sure my voice sounded incredibly frail and raspy. The federal microphone taped to my chest captured every single syllable perfectly. "I just want this to be over. I cannot manage the house or the accounts anymore. It is all too much without your mother." Bradley patted my shoulder again, a gesture so profoundly fake it felt like a physical insult. "I know, Dad. That is exactly why I am here. I will take the burden off your shoulders. Mom would have wanted me to step up and protect you." He guided me toward the table with an aggressive gentleness, pulling out a heavy leather chair near the center. I sat down awkwardly, looking completely out of place in my dirty work boots and flannel jacket among the tailored suits and expensive briefcases. Bradley turned to the other men in the room, gesturing toward me with a sad, brave smile. "Gentlemen, this is my father, Silas Croft. As you know, we tragically lost my mother a few days ago. My father has dedicated his entire life to hard labor, and he is understandably overwhelmed by the complexities of the estate transition. We are here today to formalize the transfer of the family trust and the insurance policies into my management, ensuring he is fully provided for in his retirement, while allowing our firm to utilize the liquid assets for our upcoming expansion projects." Richard, the wealthy father-in-law, leaned forward in his chair. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe impatience. "My deepest condolences on your loss, Silas. Catherine was a lovely woman. Bradley has assured us that integrating your family assets into the firm's portfolio will provide the exact capital injection we need to close the new commercial zoning deal by Friday. It is a smart move for everyone involved. You get to rest and we get to put that idle capital to aggressive work." I looked at Richard, letting my eyes widen slightly in feigned confusion. "I am sure Bradley knows what is best," I mumbled quietly. "I just fix engines. I do not understand corporate portfolios." The board partners shared a subtle, knowing look. They saw me exactly as Bradley had painted me, an ignorant, uneducated blue-collar worker who was gladly handing over his entire life savings because he was too stupid to manage it himself. They were practically salivating at the thought of unlocking Catherine's massive life insurance payout and the equity of my fully paid-off home to cover their own toxic debts. Bradley moved to the head of the table and opened a thick leather portfolio. He extracted a stack of pristine, legally binding documents and slid them across the polished wood until they rested directly in front of me. He pulled that same premium gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket, the exact same pen he had aggressively pressed into my chest while standing over his mother's unburied casket at the funeral. He placed it gently on top of the papers. "These are the final transfer documents," Dad Bradley explained smoothly, tapping the signature lines with his manicured finger. "This grants me immediate unconditional power of attorney over the estate, full executive control over the trust accounts, and authorizes the immediate release of Mom's life insurance funds directly into the firm's holding account. All you have to do is sign on the highlighted lines, and the notary waiting outside will certify it. Then all your stress is completely gone." I stared down at the documents. The bold, black letters swam in my vision. This was the exact instrument of my total ruin. This was the paper that would erase 30 years of my blood sweat and shattered joints. This was the ultimate prize Bradley had murdered his mother to obtain. Before I could even reach for the pen, Bradley turned toward a sleek silver coffee service station set up on a marble credenza against the wall. "Before we finalize everything, you look like you could use something to warm you up, Dad," Bradley said, his tone entirely casual. "You look freezing. Let me get you a cup of coffee." My entire body went rigid. The air in the boardroom suddenly felt dangerously thin. I watched him walk over to the silver pots. I watched his back as he poured the steaming dark liquid into a white porcelain cup. I watched his hands. My mind instantly flashed back to the hidden digital voicemail. I heard Catherine's terrified, rattling voice echoing in my skull. He has been putting something in my evening tea. I found the red vials in his briefcase. The disgraced pharmacist at the pill mill had confessed just hours ago. He said Bradley had paid a massive rush fee for a second dose of the untraceable digitalis derivative. He said Bradley needed to accelerate his timeline to cover a massive financial emergency. He said the second dose was specifically designed to mimic a massive natural cardiac arrest in an older man. Bradley was not just planning to steal my estate today. He was planning to execute me right here in his glass boardroom surrounded by witnesses who would testify that the grieving, exhausted old mechanic simply had a tragic, fatal heart attack right before signing over his assets. It was the perfect, monstrous crime. Bradley turned around holding the white porcelain cup. He walked slowly back to the table and placed it gently on the mahogany surface, pushing it directly toward my scarred hands. "Drink up, Dad." Bradley smiled. "It will help clear your head before you sign." I stared at the black liquid steaming in the cup. The silence in the room was absolute. The board partners were watching me with bored impatience. Richard was checking his expensive watch. They had no idea they were sitting in the middle of an active murder scene. They had no idea that a federal tactical team was listening to every single breath we took through the wire taped to my chest, waiting for my signal. I did not reach for the cup. I kept my hands resting flat on the arms of my leather chair. The frail, trembling facade I had worn since entering the building began to crack, breaking away like a rusted shell. "I am not thirsty, Bradley," I said. My voice did not tremble. It did not break. It was completely calm, incredibly deep and heavy with a dangerous, immovable authority. It was the voice of a man who commanded heavy machinery, a man who refused to yield to the storm. Bradley's fake smile faltered. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his handsome face. He noticed the sudden dramatic shift in my posture. I was no longer slumping. I was sitting perfectly straight, my broad shoulders squared, filling the space in the chair. "Come on, Dad." Bradley pushed, gesturing to the cup with a slight edge of irritation bleeding into his perfectly crafted corporate tone. "Just drink the coffee. You are shaking. You need the caffeine to focus. We have a lot of paperwork to get through, and these gentlemen have a very tight schedule today." I looked away from this cup and raised my eyes, locking my gaze directly onto his. The temperature in the room plummeted. The cold, unyielding fire that had been burning inside me since I found that tiny red vial in my kitchen flared to life, bright and completely destructive. I said, "I do not want the coffee, Bradley." I stated, my voice echoing slightly against the glass walls. "In fact, why do you not drink it? You seem incredibly anxious today. A warm beverage might calm your nerves." The boardroom went dead silent. The subtle tension instantly sharpened into a razor edge. Richard stopped checking his watch and looked up, sensing the sudden violent shift in the atmosphere. The board partners shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs. Bradley stared at me, his eyes widening slightly. The color began to drain rapidly from his cheeks. He looked at the coffee cup, then looked back at my face. He saw the absolute freezing calculation in my eyes. He realized in a fraction of a second that the broken, grieving old man he thought he had manipulated was completely gone. "Dad, stop acting strange!" Bradley hissed, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening whisper as he leaned over the table, planting his hands firmly on the wood. "Sign the documents right now. We are not playing games today." I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I rolled the cold metal between my scarred, grease-stained fingers, feeling its weight. I looked down at the highlighted signature line that would sign away my entire life and hand my son the ultimate victory he had slaughtered his mother to achieve. Then I placed the pen down on the table with a loud, sharp click. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice ringing out clearly, ensuring the federal microphone captured every single word with flawless precision. "And I am absolutely not drinking anything you hand to me." Richard slammed his hand flat on the table, his face flushing dark red with sudden anger. "Bradley, what on earth is going on here?" he demanded loudly. "You assured us your father was fully prepared to execute the asset transfer today. We do not have time to sit here and watch a family dispute. We have a multi-million-dollar commercial zoning deal resting entirely on this capital injection." Bradley panicked. The pristine corporate walls were closing in on him. He turned to his father-in-law, raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. "Richard, please just give me 1 minute. My father is just confused. The grief is severely affecting his cognitive functions. I will handle this immediately." Bradley turned back to me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate fury. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive mints on his breath, completely dropping the loving son act in front of his wealthy investors. "You listen to me, you ignorant old fool," Bradley whispered viciously, the venom pouring out of his mouth. "You are embarrassing me in front of my board. You are going to pick up that pen, you are going to sign on the dotted line, and you are going to transfer the estate right now. If you do not, I swear I will freeze every single account you have. I will throw you into the cheapest, most miserable state-run nursing home I can find, and I will leave you there to rot." I did not flinch. I did not move away from him. I sat in my chair like a massive block of solid granite. I had spent my entire life weathering brutal storms, freezing winters, and grueling labor just to give this boy the world. And this was the monster he chose to become. "You cannot freeze my accounts, Bradley," I said smoothly, letting a cold, dangerous smile touch the corners of my mouth. "And you cannot steal my house to cover your fraudulent margin calls. Your entire empire is built on a lie, and the foundation has just collapsed." Bradley froze completely. His arrogant, furious expression shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He stared at me with absolute, unadulterated horror, finally realizing that he was not the predator in this room. He was the prey, and the trap had just snapped shut. Bradley stared at me with absolute, unadulterated horror. The words I had just spoken echoed against the thick glass walls of the executive boardroom. He realized in a fraction of a second that the broken, grieving old man he thought he had manipulated was completely gone. The mask of the frail, exhausted mechanic vanished entirely from my face. I sat perfectly straight in the plush leather chair, resting my scarred, heavy hands on the polished mahogany table. My chest, where the federal wire was taped tight against my skin, felt hot with a righteous, unyielding fire. I was no longer playing the helpless victim. I was the executioner, bringing the heavy hammer of justice down on his fragile, fraudulent empire. Bradley took a stumbling step backward away from the table. His expensive, custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume on a terrified boy. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of the wealthy men gathered in the room. "Stop talking nonsense and sign the documents right now. You are embarrassing yourself in front of my investors." "I am not the one who should be embarrassed," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and devastatingly heavy. I looked directly at Richard, the wealthy father-in-law, who had provided the initial seed money for this firm. Richard was watching the exchange with narrowed, confused eyes, his face flushing a dark, angry red. "Your son-in-law does not want my signature to secure a new commercial zoning deal, Richard. He wants my life insurance money and the equity of my fully paid-off home to cover a massive illegal margin call. He has been drowning in toxic corporate debt for 8 months. He forged his own mother's signature on a $1.2 million bridge loan. And when she found out and threatened to go to the federal authorities, he decided that executing her in her own living room was easier than facing a federal prison sentence." The boardroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and angry murmurs. The senior board partners shifted violently in their chairs, completely abandoning their bored corporate postures. Richard slammed his heavy hand onto the mahogany table, demanding to know what kind of insane psychotic accusations I was throwing around his son-in-law. Bradley lunged forward, his face pale and dripping with a sudden freezing cold sweat. "He is delusional," Bradley shouted, his voice pitched high with sheer panic. "He is completely crazy with grief over losing Mom. Do not listen to a single word he says. Security. Somebody call security right now and get this maniac out of my building." But I did not wait for the building security to arrive. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my heavy flannel jacket. Bradley flinched violently, stepping back as if he expected the crazy old mechanic to pull out a loaded firearm. But the weapon I had brought to this meeting was far more precise and far more destructive than any bullet. I pulled out the tiny unmarked red glass vial. I placed it gently and deliberately in the exact center of the polished mahogany table. The clear, lethal liquid inside the red glass caught the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the towering windows. Then I reached back into my jacket pocket and pulled out the thick stack of printed financial ledgers I had physically extracted from the illegal pill mill just hours before. I dropped the heavy stack of papers right next to the vial with a loud, jarring thud that silenced the entire room. "Do you recognize this, Bradley?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the absolute attention of every single man in the room. "This is a highly concentrated synthetic digitalis derivative, a rare heart-stopping agent designed specifically to mimic a massive natural cardiac arrest. And this paper next to it is the complete unredacted financial ledger from your hired accomplice, Dr. Julian Vance. It shows the exact date you wired him $25,000 of stolen family money to manufacture this poison. It shows your encrypted emails negotiating the murder of your own mother. It also shows the $10,000 rush fee you paid him yesterday to brew a second dose, a dose specifically meant for me so you could inherit the estate today without any further questions." Bradley stared at the red vial and the printed ledger as if they were venomous snakes preparing to strike him. The remaining blood drained entirely from his handsome face, leaving him a sickening ash-gray color. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable Wall Street investment broker was completely paralyzed by the undeniable physical proof of his monstrous crimes resting right in front of his investors. He looked around the room frantically, seeking an escape route, but the heavy glass doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open with a violent, resounding crash. Attorney Thomas Wright marched into the room. His perfectly tailored tweed suit and immaculate, unbothered composure were a stark contrast to the absolute panic unfolding around the table. But Thomas was not alone. Flanking him on both sides were 4 heavily armed, uniformed federal agents wearing dark, tactical vests. Right behind them was Special Agent David Vance, his gold badge gleaming brightly against his dark suit. His eyes locked onto my son with the cold, predatory focus of a hunting hawk. "Nobody move a single muscle." Agent Vance commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable federal authority. The room froze instantly. The senior board partners raised their hands defensively, terrified of the armed federal agents storming their pristine sanctuary. Richard stumbled backward away from the table, his eyes wide with profound shock as he looked from the federal agents to the red vial and finally to the man married to his daughter. Bradley was trembling violently, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, leaning against the glass wall for physical support. Thomas Wright did not waste a single second answering the panicked questions of the executives. He walked straight past the terrified board members and approached the main audiovisual console built directly into the center of the mahogany table. He pulled a connecting auxiliary cable from the console and plugged it securely into his encrypted cell phone. He looked at me across the room and gave a short, definitive nod. The iron trap was fully assembled, and it was time to spring the final, most devastating mechanism. Thomas tapped the screen of his phone. The state-of-the-art surround sound speakers embedded in the boardroom ceiling crackled with a brief hiss of digital static. Then the agonizing, rattling voice of my beautiful deceased wife filled the sterile corporate boardroom. "Silas, if you are hearing this, I am gone. Do not let Bradley near the house. He has been putting something in my evening tea. I found the red vials in his briefcase. He needs the estate money to cover a margin call, Silas. He is killing me. Forgive me for not telling you sooner." The recording clicked off, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence that felt thick enough to physically choke on. The absolute absence of Catherine's voice was a massive void in the air. Hearing her dying breaths broadcast in this cold glass room tore at my heart, but I kept my face entirely forged in steel. I watched the faces of the wealthy men gathered around the table. The senior board partners looked physically nauseated. One of them actually covered his mouth, turning his face away toward the window in sheer, unadulterated disgust. But it was Richard's reaction that truly sealed my son's absolute ruin. The wealthy, powerful father-in-law stared at Bradley with a look of profound horror and a burning, terrifying hatred. "You murdered your own mother?" Richard whispered, his voice shaking with a volcanic rage that vibrated through the floorboards. "You poisoned the beautiful, gentle woman who gave you life just to cover up a bad real estate investment. And you have been sleeping in the same bed as my only daughter. You sick, twisted monster. You could have killed her next to cover your tracks. I swear to God I will spend every single cent of my fortune to make sure you never see the light of freedom again. My daughter is filing for divorce this exact hour, and I will personally dismantle this garbage firm piece by piece until you have absolutely nothing left." Bradley was completely surrounded with zero avenues of escape. The carefully constructed facade of his wealthy, successful life had been entirely obliterated in less than 10 minutes. His corporate investors despised him. His powerful father-in-law wanted him destroyed. The federal authorities had him dead to rights with the physical murder weapon, the financial wire receipts, the pharmacist's confession, and the audio recording from the victim herself. He looked at me, his eyes wide with the desperate, frantic panic of a cornered animal trapped in a burning cage. He finally understood that the ignorant, exhausted blue-collar mechanic he had chronically underestimated his entire life was the meticulous architect of his absolute annihilation. "Dad, please," Bradley whimpered, dropping his expensive corporate posture entirely and reverting to a terrified, pathetic child begging for salvation. "Dad, tell them it is a mistake. Tell them Mom was sick and confused. I did not mean for it to go this far. I just needed the money to save the firm. I can fix this. I can pay you back every cent. Please do not let them take me away." I did not offer him a single shred of mercy or parental comfort. I looked down at him with eyes made of freezing, immovable stone. "You made your choice, Bradley," I said, my voice lacking any trace of warmth or hesitation. "You traded your mother's beautiful life for expensive Italian suits and high-rise glass offices. You thought your greed made you untouchable. You thought you could easily outsmart an old man who spent his entire life weathering brutal storms and wrestling 1,000-pound machines. But karma is an absolute force of nature. The debt you owe has finally come due, and you are completely bankrupt in every possible way." The sheer overwhelming terror finally broke his fragile, arrogant mind. Bradley let out a primal, desperate scream and lunged aggressively away from the mahogany table. He did not run toward the main doors where the armed agents were standing shoulder to shoulder. He spun around wildly, kicking over a leather chair, and tried to sprint toward the private executive exit at the back of the boardroom. He moved fast, driven by pure adrenaline and the horrifying realization that his luxurious life was officially permanently over. But the seasoned federal agents were significantly faster. 2 massive uniformed officers intercepted him before his hand could even brush the metal door handle. They hit him simultaneously with the unstoppable force of a runaway freight train tackling him violently to the polished hardwood floor. Bradley thrashed and screamed, fighting wildly against their iron grip, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the wood. An officer grabbed him firmly by the collar of his custom-tailored suit and slammed him hard against the thick glass wall of the boardroom. The heavy physical impact rattled the glass frames and knocked the remaining breath completely out of his lungs, leaving him gasping and coughing against the transparent pane. "Bradley Croft, you are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, embezzlement, and the first-degree premeditated murder of Catherine Croft, Agent Vance," declared, loudly reading him his federal rights as the officers forcefully twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed brightly through the silent, shocked room. It was the most beautiful, deeply satisfying sound I had heard in weeks. It was the sound of a broken system being forced back into correct alignment. They yanked him roughly to his feet, hauling him up by his bound arms. His pristine suit was completely ruined, wrinkled, and covered in floor dust. His meticulously styled hair was a wild disaster hanging loosely in his tear-stained, sweating face. He was weeping openly, sobbing with loud, pathetic gasps as the tactical agents marched him forcefully toward the main double doors. He looked absolutely naked, stripped of all his stolen wealth, his fake prestige, and his arrogant corporate armor. He was no longer a hotshot investment broker impressing his wealthy peers. He was just a cowardly murderer being dragged out of his own building in heavy steel chains. As they pulled him past the mahogany table, he looked at me one last time over his shoulder. There was no entitlement or defiance left in his gaze. There was only a bottomless, crushing despair. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for a forgiveness he knew he would never receive. But I turned my back on him entirely. I did not need to hear another single word from his poisoned, lying tongue. I looked down at the tiny red vial and the printed ledger resting securely on the table. The iron trap had closed flawlessly, snapping shut with absolute lethal precision. The brutal, relentless storm I had systematically brought to his doorstep had completely washed away his fraudulent empire, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. Justice had been served, cold, precise, and absolute. 4 months passed between that explosive afternoon in the glass boardroom and the freezing winter morning we finally stepped into the federal courthouse. 4 months of endless depositions, exhaustive meetings with federal prosecutors, and the agonizing daily process of reliving my beautiful wife's murder to build an airtight case. But stepping onto the polished marble floors of that grand judicial building, I felt an unfamiliar sense of absolute, unyielding calm. I was wearing the only dark suit I owned, a simple wool two-piece I had purchased years ago for a friend's funeral. My hands permanently scarred, calloused, and deeply stained from 30 years of wrestling. Heavy diesel engines rested quietly on the solid wooden rail of the front row gallery. I was no longer the exhausted, broken, grieving widower my greedy son had tried to extort. I was a father seeking the ultimate reckoning. I was the architect of his absolute ruin, sitting in quiet dignity as I watched the unstoppable wheels of karma and justice grind aggressively into motion. The heavy oak doors at the side of the massive courtroom swung open with a loud, echoing clack that silenced the entire gallery. An armed federal bailiff stepped through, followed immediately by my son. The breath caught in the throat of every single person sitting in the room. The physical transformation was absolute and utterly devastating. The arrogant, untouchable Wall Street investment broker who had proudly strutted through his corporate glass tower in custom-tailored Italian suits was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified, hollow shell of a boy. Bradley was wearing a stiff, oversized, bright orange federal prison jumpsuit. His wrists were bound tightly in heavy steel handcuffs connected by a thick, rattling chain to the heavy shackles wrapped tightly around his ankles. He shuffled into the bright fluorescent light of the courtroom, his expensive Italian leather shoes replaced by cheap slip-on canvas sneakers. His meticulously styled hair had grown out into a greasy, unkempt mess, hanging loosely over his pale, sunken face. The arrogant sneer that used to define his every interaction had been entirely wiped away, replaced by the wide, frantic, darting eyes of a cornered animal realizing there was absolutely no escape. I watched him shuffle toward the defense table, the heavy chains dragging across the floor, and a deep, visceral satisfaction warmed the freezing blood in my veins. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a coward facing the consequences of his own monstrous greed. The trial itself was not a prolonged legal battle. It was a swift, brutal, and methodical annihilation of his entire fraudulent existence. His expensive team of corporate defense attorneys tried every desperate, dirty trick in the legal playbook to save him. They tried to suppress the audio recording my wife had left behind. They tried to paint the disgraced pharmacist who manufactured the poison as a desperate liar, simply looking for a favorable plea deal. They even tried to argue that my profound grief had driven me to fabricate the timeline of events. But the lead federal prosecutor, a relentless man who spoke with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel, dismantled their fragile lies piece by piece. When the prosecutor projected the encrypted financial ledgers onto the massive digital screens in the courtroom, showing the exact moment my stolen retirement funds were wired to an illegal pill mill to purchase the toxin, the jury audibly gasped. When the disgraced pharmacist took the witness stand, weeping openly and detailing exactly how Bradley had ordered the untraceable synthetic digitalis derivative to stop his own mother's heart, the defense attorneys physically slumped in their expensive leather chairs. But the absolute breaking point, the moment that shattered whatever microscopic shred of humanity Bradley tried to project to the jury, was when the prosecutor played Catherine's hidden voicemail from the grave. The agonizing, wet-rattling sound of my beautiful wife struggling to breathe filled the cavernous courtroom. Her terrified, weak voice echoed against the high ceilings, warning me about the red vials and naming her own son as her killer. I did not close my eyes. I did not look away. I stared directly at Bradley the entire time the audio played. He could not meet my gaze. He buried his face in his shackled hands, his shoulders shaking violently as he wept uncontrollably. He wept not out of genuine remorse for the gentle mother who had loved him unconditionally, but out of the sheer crushing terror of realizing his perfect crime had just sealed his doom in front of a federal judge and a disgusted jury. The complete destruction of his life extended far beyond the criminal charges being debated in that room. While he had been sitting in a cold concrete holding cell awaiting trial, his entire fraudulent financial empire had burned completely to the ground. Richard, his wealthy and highly influential father-in-law, had been sitting right across the aisle from me every single day of the trial. Richard looked at Bradley with a hatred so pure and concentrated it practically radiated physical heat. True to the furious promise he made in the boardroom months ago, Richard had unleashed his own army of ruthless corporate lawyers to utterly obliterate my son's finances. Bradley's wife had filed for an immediate, merciless divorce the very morning after his arrest. She stripped him of any remaining joint assets, publicly disavowed his name, and ensured he would never see a single cent of her family's fortune ever again. The financial devastation was absolute. The federal government seized his luxury vehicles, froze his hidden offshore accounts, and placed aggressive tax liens on every single piece of commercial property his firm had ever touched to pay restitution. As for me, the justice system moved with surprising speed to correct the horrific forgery that started this entire nightmare. The federal judge had signed a massive stack of emergency injunctions nullifying the fraudulent bridge loan he had taken out against our property. The bank, terrified of the intense federal scrutiny surrounding the murder investigation, immediately reverted the deed of my house back into my name entirely free and clear. Furthermore, every single cent of the retirement savings he had systematically stolen from my union pension was tracked down and returned directly to my accounts. Bradley was left with absolutely nothing. He was a complete pauper, a ruined beggar wrapped in heavy steel chains, entirely dependent on a frustrated public defender who clearly despised sitting next to him. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the foreman stood up to read the final verdict, the silence in the room was so profound you could hear the soft humming of the air conditioning vents and the frantic, shallow breathing coming from the defense table. Guilty on the charges of grand larceny. Guilty on the charges of federal wire fraud. Guilty on the charges of embezzlement. And finally, the heavy hammer drop that resonated through the very marrow of my tired bones. Guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. Bradley collapsed forward onto the polished wooden table, letting out a raw, guttural wail that sounded entirely inhuman. It was the desperate, agonizing scream of a man watching his entire life evaporate into thin air. His defense lawyers did not even try to comfort him. They did not place a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They simply gathered their legal pads and clicked their pens, recognizing a completely lost cause. The judge did not wait for a separate sentencing hearing to deliver the final blow. She was a stern, older woman with sharp eyes, and she looked down at my son from her elevated bench with a profound disgust that transcended all professional boundaries. She adjusted her glasses and told him that in her 3 decades serving on the federal bench, she had never witnessed an act of such calculated parasitic malice. She told him that weaponizing the unconditional love of a devoted mother and deliberately poisoning her in her own living room simply to cover a careless financial failure stripped him of his fundamental right to ever participate in human society again. She stated clearly that men who prey on the sacrifices of their aging parents deserve no mercy, no sympathy, and absolutely no leniency under the law. With a single thunderous strike of her wooden gavel, she handed down the absolute maximum sentence allowed by the justice system. Life in a maximum security federal prison without the possibility of parole plus 40 consecutive years for the massive financial crimes. He would never breathe free air again. He would die behind thick, unyielding concrete walls entirely forgotten by the high society world he had tried so desperately and ruthlessly to conquer. The armed bailiffs stepped forward and hauled him roughly to his feet. His legs could no longer support his own weight. He was entirely dead weight, dragging his cheap canvas sneakers across the polished courtroom floor as the officers pulled him forcefully toward the side exit door. As he passed the wooden gallery rail where I was standing, he raised his heavy head. His face was completely soaked in cold sweat and tears, his eyes red, swollen, and filled with a bottomless despair. He looked directly at me, his lips trembling violently, silently begging for a single shred of the paternal protection he had so ruthlessly exploited and discarded. He wanted the old forgiving mechanic to tell him everything would be all right, but I had absolutely nothing left to give him. The gentle sacrificing father who had broken his bones, poured his sweat, and traded his youth to build that boy a golden future had died the exact moment I found that tiny red vial hidden in the kitchen tea tin. I stood perfectly still, a working-class man forged from unyielding iron, my face a mask of cold, immovable stone. I looked my son dead in the eye, offering him no comfort, no rage, and no forgiveness. Then I simply turned my back on him. I did not look over my shoulder as he began to sob uncontrollably. I did not flinch when the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind him, sealing him in total darkness for the rest of his natural life. I walked out of the federal courthouse and stepped into the freezing, bright winter air. The heavy, suffocating weight I had been carrying since the day of Catherine's funeral was finally gone. The house was mine again. My retirement was secure. But more importantly, the woman I loved with all my heart could finally rest in peace knowing her sacrifice had not been in vain. Karma had collected its massive debt and justice had been served with absolute uncompromising perfection. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse closed behind me, sealing the darkest and most agonizing chapter of my life inside those cold marble walls. I stood alone on the wide concrete steps, breathing in the freezing winter air. It filled my lungs with a sharp, biting clarity. For the first time in 4 months, the suffocating weight that had been crushing my chest was entirely gone. I walked slowly down to my rusted Ford truck, my heavy work boots thudding rhythmically against the pavement. When I gripped the cold steering wheel and turned the ignition, the familiar roar of the rebuilt diesel engine sounded like a victory march. I drove out of the bustling downtown financial district, leaving behind the towering glass skyscrapers that housed the ruthless corporate predators of the world. I was heading back to the quiet, grounded reality of my suburban Pennsylvania neighborhood. The miles rolled by, and with every passing minute, the profound devastation of the trial began to settle into a deep, unwavering peace. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine. The property was completely silent. The memory of my son's glossy luxury vehicle blocking the path was nothing more than a fading ghost. I walked up the concrete walkway that I had poured myself 3 decades ago. I unlocked the front door and stepped across the threshold. The ambient temperature of the house was warm, but more importantly, the atmosphere was entirely clean. For months, the air inside these walls had been thick and toxic, laced with the horrifying memory of betrayal and the phantom scent of the poison that stole my beautiful wife. Now the silence was no longer a heavy, crushing void. It was a peaceful, welcoming stillness. I walked directly into the living room and looked at Catherine's favorite floral armchair sitting by the window. I did not break down and weep. The agonizing tears had all been shed on the cold kitchen tiles months ago. Instead, a profound sense of tranquility washed over my weary bones. I sat down in my own heavy recliner across the room. I looked down at my hands. The thick calluses, the swollen joints, and the permanent grease stains were the map of my entire existence. I had spent 30 years wrestling 1,000-pound engine blocks and breathing toxic exhaust fumes, sacrificing my own physical body to provide a golden future for my family. I had believed that delivering financial wealth was the ultimate expression of fatherly devotion. My unconditional love had been pure, even when my own flesh and blood weaponized it against me to mask a massive corporate fraud. I realized, sitting in that quiet room, that I had absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. My conscience was impeccably clean. The financial aftermath of the trial was a complete and total restoration of my life's work. Attorney Thomas Wright had executed the legal maneuvers with flawless surgical precision. The fraudulent bridge loan that threatened to consume my lifelong sanctuary was completely nullified by the federal judge. The massive debts were erased as if they had never existed. My stolen union pension and drained retirement accounts were fully restored, seized directly from my son's frozen corporate assets, before the government dismantled the rest of his fraudulent empire. I was completely financially secure. The house belonged to me entirely free and clear. But the victory felt incredibly heavy when I looked at the bank statements detailing Catherine's massive life insurance payout. That staggering sum of money was the ultimate prize my son had executed his own mother to obtain. I stared at the numbers on the page and felt a cold wave of disgust. I completely refused to spend a single cent of that blood money on my own personal comfort. A man who has spent his entire adult life mastering the brutal elements of blue-collar labor does not need a sprawling mansion, expensive custom suits, or luxury vehicles. I needed integrity. I contacted Thomas Wright and my sister-in-law, Sarah Higgins, the very next morning. We gathered around the same polished mahogany desk where we had planned the iron trap, but this time we were drawing the blueprints for a lasting legacy. We took the entirety of the life insurance payout along with a massive portion of my recovered financial assets and poured it into a highly secure legal trust. We established the Catherine Croft Memorial Foundation. Our very first initiative was a comprehensive, fully funded scholarship program for young men and women from working-class families who desperately wanted to attend specialized trade schools. I wanted to empower young people to work with their hands to learn honest, brutal, beautiful labor. I wanted to fund the next generation of diesel mechanics, electricians, welders, and carpenters. I wanted to elevate the men and women who actually build the physical foundation of this world, deliberately standing in stark opposition to the arrogant investment brokers who only know how to steal from it with forged signatures. The second wing of the foundation was born directly from the darkest moments of my own nightmare. We created a dedicated legal and financial support fund specifically designed for elderly victims of domestic and financial abuse. I knew firsthand the paralyzing, suffocating terror of realizing your own family is systematically preying upon you. Financial abuse of the elderly is a silent, creeping epidemic in our society. We funded a network of aggressive, relentless attorneys who provide absolute free legal counsel to aging parents whose children are attempting to extort them, forge their deeds, or steal their life savings. I transformed my deepest, most agonizing personal tragedy into an impenetrable legal shield for the most vulnerable members of our society. Sarah Higgins gladly stepped up to manage the foundation's daily administrative operations. Her profound, shattering grief over losing her older sister was instantly channeled into fierce protective advocacy. I visit the foundation office several times a week. I personally meet the young mechanics receiving the tuition scholarships. I shake their hands, feeling the familiar, comforting, rough texture of hard work and honest ambition. I sit down with the elderly men and women whose family homes were saved by our legal intervention fund. When they hold my scarred hands and thank me with tears streaming down their faces, I simply smile and tell them that I am just an old union mechanic doing routine maintenance on a broken world. In the quiet moments of the evening, I often find myself reflecting on Bradley. I think about my son sitting in a tiny, barren concrete cell in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He has absolutely no tailored suits, no luxury vehicles, and no wealthy father-in-law coming to bail him out. He is entirely stripped of his arrogant facade, condemned to spend the rest of his natural life staring at a steel door. I realize the absolute, undeniable nature of karma. Karma is not some mystical, invisible magic floating in the sky. It is the fundamental, inescapable law of cause and effect. It is the brutal reality that when you build a lavish empire on a foundation of lies, deceit, and the blood of your own mother, the structure will inevitably collapse and crush you under its immense, unforgiving weight. As a mechanic, I understand the nature of greed through the lens of a catastrophic engine failure. When a reckless driver ignores the glowing warning lights on the dashboard, when they deliberately bypass the safety valves to push a machine far beyond its natural limits just to achieve a temporary burst of speed, they guarantee a violent and fiery explosion. Bradley pushed his life past the absolute red line of human morality. He severed the fuel lines of unconditional family love simply to feed his insatiable, bottomless corporate ego. He completely devoured his own soul from the inside out, long before the federal handcuffs ever clicked securely around his wrists. Those who prey on the unconditional love of their parents will ultimately consume themselves. I look at the sharp contrast between the working class and the elite predators who walk among us. I spent my life wearing heavy work boots and faded flannel shirts, ashamed sometimes that I could not provide the sophisticated pedigree my son desperately craved. I realize now that absolute character, unshakable integrity, and unrelenting grit are the only true inheritance a parent can leave behind. A man can wear a custom Italian suit, drink expensive champagne, and possess the dark, rotting soul of a starving, rabid animal. True strength is not found in high-rise glass boardrooms. It is found on the cold concrete floors of garages in the calloused hands of people who earn their daily bread through honest, back-breaking sweat. I found my ultimate peace when the bitter winter thawed into a bright, vibrant spring. I spend my early mornings tending to Catherine's garden in the backyard. I get my scarred hands deep into the dark, rich soil, pulling weeds and planting new seeds. I carefully cultivate the beautiful white lilies she loved so much. The physical grounding labor is a profound healing balm for my weary soul. I talk to her quietly while I work the earth. I tell her about the young students the foundation has put through trade school. I tell her about the grandmothers who get to sleep safely in their own beds because we fought off their greedy relatives. I tell her that her agonizing sacrifice was the initial spark that ignited a massive, unstoppable wave of absolute justice. The price of unbridled greed is total and permanent annihilation. A father's love is a boundless ocean of patience and sacrifice, willing to endure decades of physical pain to provide for his child. But when that pure love is brutally betrayed, when it is manipulated and weaponized for financial gain, it transforms into an immovable mountain of righteous, freezing fury. The good guys do not always win because of simple luck or wishful thinking. They win because they possess the unbreakable, unyielding resolve to stand completely firm in the absolute darkest of storms. They win because the truth is a relentless physical force of nature that cannot be buried in a shallow grave. The quiet house is full of light now. The tired diesel mechanic has finally laid down his heavy tools. The brutal war is over. The victory is complete. The moral scales of the universe are perfectly balanced once again. Did this story resonate with you? karma always collects its debts. If you're listening to this right now, drop a comment and let me know your exact location and time. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the good guys always win in the end. See you in the next life story with love and respect.